The early 20th century was a time of great change for Japan, a nation that had once been isolated from the rest of the world but was now undergoing rapid modernization. In this era of transformation, Emperor Hirohito, born in 1901, would rise to become one of the most enduring symbols of his nation's history. His reign, which spanned much of the century, saw Japan's rise as a global power, its involvement in war, and its eventual emergence into peace and prosperity after decades of upheaval. Hirohito's early years were shaped by the legacy of the Meiji Restoration, a time when Japan opened its doors to the world after centuries of seclusion. As the son of Emperor Taisho, he grew up in a world that was as steeped in ancient tradition as it was evolving rapidly. His journey through childhood and education, his eventual ascension to the throne, and the role he would play in guiding Japan through its most challenging moments in history, is a story marked by both continuity and change. As we journey through the life of Emperor Hirohito, let the world around you grow quiet, and allow the soft rhythms of this narrative to guide you into rest. Through the triumphs, the trials, and the transformation of Japan itself, this is the entire story of a man who lived at the very center of one of the most significant eras in modern history. Take a moment now, settle in, and drift gently into the calm unfolding of Emperor Hirohito's life. Emperor Hirohito, born on April 29, 1901, was the first son of Emperor Taisho and Empress Teimei. His birth came during a period of great change for Japan, which had emerged from centuries of isolation and was now rapidly transforming into a modern industrial nation. The Meiji Restoration, which had begun in 1868, had laid the groundwork for a new Japan. In this era, Hirohito's family stood at the very heart of the nation's identity, rooted deeply in the traditions of the imperial line, but also navigating the complex challenges of a world in flux. The young Hirohito's early life was one of privilege but also of expectation. As the heir to the chrysanthemum throne, the most revered position in Japan, he was destined to a life shaped by duty and tradition. His father, Emperor Taisho, had ascended the throne in 1912, but his reign was marred by health problems. It was under these circumstances that Hirohito was raised, preparing not only for the role of emperor but also for the weight of leadership in a country that was undergoing profound changes. Hirohito's mother, Empress Teimei, was a significant influence in his early life. She was a deeply dedicated mother and played an active role in his upbringing. As a child, Hirohito was sheltered from the complexities of imperial politics, allowed instead to focus on his education. He was taught by a series of tutors who were charged with instilling in him the knowledge and virtues expected of a future emperor. His early education included studies in history, philosophy, and the classics, with a particular emphasis on the sacred duties of the emperor in the context of Japan's long history. Though Hirohito was carefully guided through his early years, his life was not without personal challenge. His father's health problems cast a long shadow over the imperial household, and Hirohito, even as a young boy, was acutely aware of the fragility of his position as the future emperor. He also faced the emotional difficulty of growing up in a family where the bond between father and son was strained by distance, both physical and emotional. Emperor Taisho, though revered as the emperor, struggled with mental and physical health issues, leaving much of the imperial work to be managed by his advisors. This situation created a unique environment for young Hirohito, one in which he would often see the duties of the emperor carried out in ways that were distant from his own experiences. Despite this distance from his father, Hirohito was not isolated from the affairs of the nation. He was raised in the imperial palace in Tokyo, and it was here that he began to grasp the gravity of his future role. While his family life was filled with the comforts and rituals of the imperial court, Hirohito's future was always framed by the expectations that came with his status as the heir to the throne. Every part of his upbringing was designed to prepare him to rule, even if that role was many years away. As Hirohito grew older, his education deepened. He was tutored by some of the finest scholars in Japan, who instilled in him a sense of reverence for Japan's imperial heritage. His education was grounded in both Western and Japanese thought, a reflection of the global shift Japan was experiencing at the time. Hirohito, though surrounded by traditional Japanese rituals, was also exposed to the ideas of modernization and industrialization. This blend of influences would come to shape not only his personal worldview, but also the decisions he would make as the Emperor of Japan. In his formative years, Hirohito was not a public figure. The imperial family, though central to Japan's identity, kept a quiet presence in the nation's daily life. Hirohito was often shielded from the press and the broader world of politics. However, as he grew into adolescence, the pressures of his position became more apparent. In the early 1900s, Japan was emerging as a major global power, and the imperial family, particularly the emperor, was a key figure in maintaining national unity and stability. This period also marked the rise of militarism within Japan, and Hirohito's education began to reflect this shift. The changing political landscape of Japan was a significant factor in shaping Hirohito's early years. By the time Hirohito reached his teenage years, Japan had already engaged in several military conflicts, including the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, which had elevated Japan's status on the world stage. The rise of militarism during the Taisho period, alongside Japan's increasing industrialization, set the stage for Hirohito's eventual leadership. Though Hirohito was not yet directly involved in the affairs of the state, he was aware of the changing currents around him, and his role would soon be tested in ways he could not have predicted. Hirohito's early family life, then, was one of both privilege and pressure. His upbringing was steeped in the rituals and traditions of the imperial family, yet it was also marked by the uncertainty surrounding his father's health and the growing expectations placed upon him as the future emperor. His education was carefully designed to prepare him for his future role, and though he was shielded from the political complexities of the time, the influence of Japan's modernization was never far from his view. In these early years, Hirohito was slowly molded into the figure who would later become one of the most influential leaders in Japanese history. The foundation for his reign was laid not only by his education and upbringing, but also by the broader societal and political changes occurring in Japan during his formative years. The Japan Hirohito would inherit was vastly different from the one in which he was raised, but his early experiences in the imperial household would serve as the backdrop for his leadership in the tumultuous years to come. As Emperor Hirohito entered his teenage years, his education became the central focus of his life. Raised within the confines of the imperial palace, his early schooling was deeply influenced by the formalities and traditions of the Japanese court. However, Japan itself was undergoing a period of rapid modernization, and Hirohito's education would reflect the need to blend Japan's rich imperial heritage with the realities of a changing world. In the early years of the 20th century, Japan had already begun its transformation into a modern industrialized nation. By the time Hirohito was reaching adolescence, the Meiji Restoration, the movement that had ended Japan's centuries-long isolation and opened the country to the West, had already set the stage for the rapid changes taking place. Hirohito's education was shaped by this delicate balance between tradition and modernity. He was raised with a strong emphasis on classical Japanese history, culture, and the sacred role of the emperor in society. At the same time, the global influence of Western thought and science was becoming more prominent in Japan's development, and these ideas would also be integrated into Hirohito's academic training. His formal education began with tutors and scholars chosen by his father, Emperor Taisho, and his mother, Empress Taimei. They believed that Hirohito's early education should reflect the values and customs of Japan's royal family, while also equipping him with the skills and knowledge to navigate the modern world. He received lessons in classical Japanese literature, calligraphy, and the principles of Shintoism, the state religion that closely tied the emperor to the divine. As he grew older, the influence of Western education began to take hold. At the age of 11, Hirohito was sent to study at the Gakushuin Peers School, a prestigious institution reserved for the children of the Japanese aristocracy. It was here that Hirohito was first exposed to a more structured academic environment, and where his education began to expand beyond the traditional teachings of the imperial court. The Gakushuin curriculum included subjects such as foreign languages, Western history, and the sciences, subjects that were new to many students of the time but essential for Japan's modernization. One of the key influences on Hirohito during this period was his love for the natural world, particularly marine biology. From a young age, he developed an interest in the study of sea life, and this interest would become a lifelong passion. In his early studies, Hirohito immersed himself in the works of Western scientists such as Charles Darwin, and began to develop his own ideas about the natural world. He was particularly fascinated by marine biology, and this interest would shape much of his later scientific work. While his peers were focused on traditional subjects like literature and philosophy, Hirohito's curiosity led him to explore the natural world in ways that were unique for a member of the imperial family. His interest in marine biology was not merely academic, it became an essential part of his identity. Hirohito spent much of his free time studying the oceans and the creatures that lived within them. He even began to collect specimens of fish and other marine life, establishing an extensive collection that he kept throughout his life. This deep connection to the natural world became a defining feature of Hirohito's character, and it would influence both his public persona and his personal life. However, Hirohito's education was not solely focused on scientific pursuits. He was also required to learn the duties and responsibilities that would come with his position as emperor. He studied the history of the Japanese imperial family and its role in the nation's governance, and he learned about the Shinto religion, which held the emperor to be a divine figure. These lessons were important for Hirohito as they reinforced the idea that his life was not solely his own, but was bound to the traditions and responsibilities of the imperial family. The weight of his future role as emperor was always present, even during his studies. In addition to his academic education, Hirohito also received practical training in diplomacy and governance. As a future ruler, he needed to understand the intricacies of statecraft and international relations. He was exposed to various leaders and intellectuals, both Japanese and foreign, who would influence his understanding of the world. This was a time of growing tension in East Asia, and Japan's relationship with Western powers was becoming increasingly strained. Hirohito's education reflected the global changes occurring during his lifetime, and he was trained to navigate the complex political environment that would soon define his reign. Throughout his formative years, Hirohito was shaped by both the traditions of the imperial family and the emerging global forces that were beginning to shape Japan's destiny. His early education was marked by a careful balance of ancient wisdom and modern knowledge, a reflection of the delicate path Japan was following as it transitioned from a feudal society to a modern industrialized nation. Hirohito's education was also a means of preparing him for the immense responsibility that would fall upon his shoulders as the future emperor. However, Hirohito's education was not without its challenges. As a member of the royal family, he was often isolated from the world around him. The pressure to live up to the expectations of his position was ever present, and he had little opportunity to form close personal relationships outside of the palace. His tutors and advisors were carefully selected to guide him, but the distance between him and the outside world often created a sense of emotional isolation. Hirohito's personal life in many ways was molded by the heavy burden of his future role, and this sense of isolation would continue throughout his reign. As Hirohito moved into his late teenage years, his education reached its final stages, preparing him for the transition from prince to emperor. His studies in science, diplomacy and governance would serve him well in the years to come, as Japan's political landscape began to change. But perhaps the most lasting influence on Hirohito during these years was his love for the natural world. His connection to the oceans and the creatures that lived within them would remain a source of solace and strength throughout his life, providing him with a sense of personal peace amidst the demands of his imperial duties. In the years to come, as Hirohito ascended the throne and faced the challenges of leadership during a time of war and national upheaval, the lessons he learned during his formative years would shape his actions and decisions. His education, grounded in both the ancient traditions of Japan and the emerging forces of the modern world, would guide him as he navigated the turbulent years that lay ahead. In December 1926, Japan found itself standing at a crossroads. Emperor Taisho, Hirohito's father, had ruled the country since 1912, but his reign had been plagued by poor health, both physical and mental, which limited his ability to govern effectively. By the mid-1920s, it became clear that Emperor Taisho would not be able to continue for much longer. His declining health, which had been a concern for many years, meant that Japan's future would soon rest in the hands of his son, the young Emperor Hirohito. At the age of 25, Hirohito had already been groomed for leadership for most of his life. Though still a young man, his education, training and preparation had all been focused on the immense responsibility he would inherit. Yet, no amount of preparation could ever fully ready someone for the moment when a beloved family member, particularly a father, passed away. The transition from the era of Emperor Taisho to the beginning of the Showa period, the era name associated with Hirohito's reign, was a solemn one, marked by national mourning and reflection on the past and future. In the hours following Emperor Taisho's death, the transition was swift, as was customary for the Japanese imperial family. Emperor Taisho passed away on December 25, 1926, and his son, Hirohito, was immediately proclaimed emperor. This marked the beginning of Hirohito's reign and a new chapter in the history of Japan. It was a pivotal moment, but one that was also largely ceremonial. Hirohito's coronation did not immediately change the course of Japan's politics. The nation continued to be governed by the political and military elite, and Hirohito's role, at least in the early days of his reign, was more symbolic than practical. Hirohito's ascension to the throne marked the formal beginning of the Showa era, a name that would come to symbolize a time of dramatic change for Japan. His reign would span over 6 decades and encompass some of the most turbulent and transformative periods in Japanese and world history. However, at the time of his accession, Hirohito was still largely an observer, not yet thrust into the active political and military decisions that would define his reign. The early years of his reign would be marked by a quiet consolidation of power, as Hirohito navigated the delicate balance between his symbolic role and the growing influence of the military. During the early years of the Showa era, Hirohito's position was influenced by a number of factors. First and foremost, Japan's political system was dominated by the military and bureaucratic elite, many of whom believed that Japan's future lay in an increasingly militarized society. Hirohito, despite his education and preparation, had limited experience in direct governance at the time of his accession. His father had remained relatively passive during his reign, leaving much of the decision-making to his ministers. Now, as the new emperor, Hirohito would need to carefully navigate his relationship with Japan's military leaders and the rising tide of nationalism. The military's growing power within Japan was a defining characteristic of the 1920s and 1930s. This was a time when Japan was grappling with its identity on the global stage, and the idea of national strength and military prowess became increasingly central to Japanese politics. The military had already begun to assert itself in the political realm, and Hirohito's reign would coincide with a rise in militaristic ideals. The First Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895, and the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905, had established Japan as a formidable military power in East Asia, but the interwar period saw a sharp increase in militaristic rhetoric and actions. In the years following Hirohito's accession, Japan's political and military establishment became more increasingly inclined to pursue aggressive foreign policies. At home, there were calls for Japan to assert itself more boldly in Asia, and abroad, Japan's imperial ambitions grew. Hirohito's role as emperor was becoming more complex, as his position was inextricably linked to the decisions of the military and the government. Despite his symbolic position, Hirohito was not entirely powerless. As the nation's emperor, he held immense moral authority, and his actions carried great weight. However, his ability to influence political decisions was limited, especially in the face of rising militarism. Japan's political environment during the early years of his reign was volatile, with numerous factions vying for control. The military, which was becoming more influential, often saw itself as the true protector of Japan's interests, particularly in its growing imperialistic ambitions. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, Hirohito took a more passive approach to governance. His duties were largely ceremonial, with the day-to-day management of the state handled by his ministers. The prime ministers, generals, and other political leaders were the ones who shaped Japan's domestic and foreign policies. Hirohito, for much of this time, remained in the background, observing the political changes unfolding around him. However, the growing influence of the military would soon bring Hirohito into the center of Japan's political life. In 1931, the situation changed dramatically with the Mukden incident and the subsequent Japanese invasion of Manchuria. The military's decision to invade was a critical turning point. Hirohito, who'd been mostly removed from direct involvement in political and military decisions, was now faced with the reality of Japan's growing militarism. The invasion of Manchuria and the establishment of the puppet state of Manchukuo would set Japan on a path toward even greater militarization, ultimately leading to its involvement in World War II. The early years of Hirohito's reign were defined by a sense of passive observation. He'd inherited the mantle of leadership at a time when Japan's political system was being shaped by powerful military and political elites. While Hirohito may have held the title of emperor, he was not yet at the forefront of the decisions that would push Japan toward war. It was a time of careful observation, as Hirohito learned the complexities of leadership in a nation that was rapidly evolving. Yet, the transition from the Taisho to the Showa era marked the beginning of Hirohito's journey into the heart of Japan's history. His reign would come to define the trajectory of the nation through some of its darkest moments, and the decisions he would face as Japan moved closer to the global conflict of the 1940s would test his leadership in ways he had not yet imagined. Emperor Hirohito's reign began with a sense of calm and continuity, but beneath the surface, the political landscape of Japan was shifting rapidly. The Showa era, named after Hirohito, started in December 1926 with the death of his father, Emperor Taisho. At the time of his ascension, Hirohito was still a young man, only 25 years old, and he inherited a throne at a time when Japan was undergoing profound changes, both domestically and internationally. In the early years of Hirohito's reign, Japan was still a constitutional monarchy, and the emperor's role was largely symbolic. The real power lay with the government officials, military leaders, and bureaucrats, who made decisions on Japan's behalf. Despite the emperor's symbolic authority, Japan's political system was marked by a growing influence of military leaders, especially after the end of the First World War. The nation was entering a period of increased nationalism and militarism, which would eventually lead to significant global conflict. However, at this early point in Hirohito's reign, the emperor had limited involvement in the daily governance of the nation. During this time, Japan was still struggling to find its place in the global order. It was a nation that had emerged from centuries of isolation, and it now faced the challenges of competing with Western powers on the world stage. The Meiji era, which had seen Japan modernize rapidly, was now in the past, and Japan was transitioning into a new phase of its national identity. The political system, dominated by the military and conservative factions, was beginning to shift towards more aggressive policies, and Hirohito found himself at the center of the political storm, though not yet an active participant in the decision-making processes. The early years of Hirohito's reign were marked by significant domestic challenges. Japan was struggling with the economic effects of the Great Depression, which had gripped the world in the early 1930s. The Japanese economy, dependent on international trade, was hit hard by the global economic downturn, leading to widespread unemployment and social unrest. The government's attempts to stabilize the economy were met with limited success, and many of the political leaders, military leaders, and business figures began to look for more drastic solutions. In response to these challenges, the military began to assert greater influence over the government. A number of right-wing groups within the military saw the economic crisis as an opportunity to expand Japan's territorial holdings and increase its military strength. This nationalist, militaristic ideology would become the foundation for Japan's actions in the years to come. The rise of these ideas came at a time when Hirohito was still very much in the background of politics. His role was ceremonial, and he relied heavily on his advisors and officials to manage the affairs of state. However, Hirohito was far from passive. As emperor, he understood that Japan's direction depended on the decisions made by those in power. In his early years as emperor, Hirohito began to meet with key military and political leaders, developing relationships that would shape the course of Japan's history. He did not hold direct control over the military, but his status as emperor lent him immense moral authority. This made him an important figurehead for the military's plans, even if he was not fully engaged in the day-to-day decisions. The most significant event of these early years was the Manchurian Incident of 1931. This was a pivotal moment in Hirohito's reign, as Japan's military took matters into their own hands, invading Manchuria in northeastern China without the explicit approval of the civilian government. The military's actions were an attempt to secure resources and expand Japan's territory, but they also mark the beginning of Japan's increasingly aggressive stance toward its neighbors. The Manchurian Incident exposed the growing divide between the military and civilian leadership in Japan. The military, emboldened by its successes, began to exert greater control over the government, pushing for more expansionist policies. The civilian government, meanwhile, struggled to keep pace with the demands of the military. Hirohito, as emperor, was caught in the middle of this struggle. While he did not directly order the invasion of Manchuria, his role as the figurehead of the state meant that the military often looked to him for approval and support. Hirohito's response to the incident was measured and restrained. He did not speak publicly on the matter, but he expressed concern about the military's actions and their impact on Japan's international standing. In the aftermath of the Manchurian Incident, Hirohito's relationship with the military grew more complex. The military leaders, emboldened by their success in Manchuria, began to push for more power and influence in Japan's political system. As a result, Hirohito found himself in a delicate position. On one hand, he needed to maintain the support of the military, which was becoming increasingly influential. On the other hand, he was aware of the potential consequences of the military's growing power, both for Japan and for his own position as emperor. Despite these challenges, Hirohito's early years as emperor were also marked by some successes. In 1932, Hirohito made his first state visit to Manchukuo, the puppet state created by Japan in Manchuria. This trip was significant not only as a diplomatic gesture, but also as a way for Hirohito to strengthen his relationship with the military leaders who had been instrumental in the Manchurian Incident. The visit marked a shift in Japan's foreign policy, as the emperor was seen as lending his support to Japan's expansionist efforts in Asia. As Hirohito's reign continued, the military's influence over Japan's domestic and foreign policy only grew stronger. The growing tensions between Japan and the Western powers, particularly the United States, were beginning to shape the political climate. Hirohito's role as emperor was increasingly tied to the nation's military actions, and his moral authority was being used to justify the aggressive policies being pursued by the government. Despite the growing militarization of Japan, Hirohito remained somewhat detached from the political and military decisions that were being made. He was not directly responsible for the actions of the military, but his role as emperor meant that his image was closely associated with Japan's expanding military ambitions. The early years of his reign were thus a time of uncertainty, as Hirohito struggled to navigate the shifting power dynamics within Japan. These years marked the beginning of a long and tumultuous reign for Hirohito. His early years as emperor were filled with challenges, both domestic and international, and his role was one that balanced between symbolic leadership and a growing military influence that was reshaping the nation. Hirohito's responses to these challenges, though often restrained and cautious, would shape his legacy in the years to come. The Manchurian Incident of 1931 marked a pivotal moment in both Emperor Hirohito's reign and Japan's path toward war. The incident began on September 18, 1931, when Japanese soldiers staged an attack on the Chinese railway in Manchuria, a region in northeastern China that was rich in natural resources. The Japanese military quickly seized control of the area, and by the end of the year, Japan had established the puppet state of Manchukuo, effectively controlling Manchuria. The invasion was not authorized by the civilian government or Hirohito himself, but the military acted swiftly and without consultation. The decision was made by the Kwantung Army, a Japanese military unit stationed in Manchuria, which had grown increasingly autonomous and influential within the broader Japanese military establishment. The incident exposed the growing power of the military within Japan and its willingness to disregard civilian authority in pursuit of territorial expansion. In this way, the Manchurian Incident marked the beginning of a new era for Japan, one in which the military increasingly dictated the course of the nation's policies. At the time of the incident, Hirohito was still a relatively new emperor, having ascended the throne in December 1926. He had inherited a country that was undergoing significant political and social changes, and Japan's imperial ambitions were becoming more pronounced. While Hirohito had been groomed for leadership and had received an education focused on Japan's imperial history and governance, he was not yet fully involved in the day-to-day decisions of the government. The Manchurian Incident, however, would force Hirohito to confront the increasingly powerful military establishment and its influence over the direction of Japan. Despite his ceremonial position, Hirohito was aware of the situation unfolding in Manchuria. As emperor, his moral authority was significant, and his image was closely associated with the military's actions. While Hirohito did not directly order the invasion, the Japanese military sought his approval in the aftermath of the incident. The emperor's endorsement, whether formal or not, would lend legitimacy to the military's actions and provide a sense of national unity. Hirohito's passive response to the incident would contribute to his growing association with Japan's militaristic agenda. The incident marked the beginning of a broader shift in Japanese politics, as the military's influence over the government increased. In the years leading up to World War II, Japan's government became more militarized, with the military increasingly dictating foreign policy and domestic decisions. The invasion of Manchuria and the subsequent creation of Manchukuo were seen by many military leaders as a necessary step in Japan's expansionist policies. The belief in Japan's divine right to dominate Asia grew stronger, and the military's control over the government meant that there was little resistance to these ideas. Hirohito's role during the Manchurian Incident was largely one of passive observation, as the military moved forward with its plans regardless of his involvement. However, his response to the incident was critical in shaping his relationship with the military and his eventual involvement in Japan's broader imperial ambitions. Hirohito's cautious stance, coupled with his reliance on military advice, would define much of his leadership during the early years of his reign. In this sense, the Manchurian incident set the stage for Hirohito's gradual but increasing involvement in the decisions that would lead Japan into a wider conflict with the rest of the world. The international reaction to the Manchurian incident was largely negative. The League of Nations condemned Japan's actions and called for the withdrawal of Japanese forces from Manchuria. However, Japan ignored the League's protests, and the invasion of Manchuria became a symbol of Japan's growing defiance of international norms and its shift toward militarism. The invasion was also seen as an affront to China, and it marked the beginning of a long period of conflict between Japan and China that would eventually lead to the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937. For Hirohito, the Manchurian incident represented the first major test of his reign. He was faced with a military that was increasingly powerful and an international community that was becoming more hostile to Japan's expansionist ambitions. Although he did not directly intervene in the military's actions, Hirohito's decisions during this period would influence Japan's path toward war. The growing militarization of Japan, coupled with Hirohito's passive role in the decision-making process, set the stage for Japan's involvement in World War II. During this time, the emperor's relationship with Japan's political and military leaders grew increasingly complex. As the military's influence grew, Hirohito found himself in a difficult position. On one hand, he needed to maintain the support of the military, which was essential to Japan's national security. On the other hand, Hirohito was aware of the potential consequences of Japan's militaristic policies, both domestically and internationally. His role as emperor was becoming more entangled with the actions of the military, and his ability to maintain a sense of neutrality was increasingly compromised. The Manchurian incident also had profound implications for Japan's relationship with the Western powers. The United States, in particular, viewed Japan's actions with growing concern. In 1931, the US had been involved in the Washington Naval Conference, which sought to limit the naval arms race and maintain peace in the Pacific. Japan's actions in Manchuria threatened to upset the delicate balance of power in the region and raised alarms in Washington. In response, the United States implemented economic sanctions against Japan and began to take a more active stance in opposing Japanese expansion. Despite the international backlash, Japan continued to pursue its expansionist policies in Asia. The Manchurian incident was only the beginning of a series of aggressive actions by Japan, which would culminate in the full-scale invasion of China in 1937. The military's power continued to grow, and Hirohito's involvement in Japan's decisions became more pronounced. The tension between Japan's military and civilian leaders, coupled with the increasing pressure from the international community, would shape the course of Hirohito's reign and lead Japan into the broader conflict of World War II. The years following the Manchurian incident marked a turning point in both Japan's domestic politics and its relationship with the rest of the world. The military, emboldened by its success in Manchuria, continued to assert its dominance over the nation's political and military decision-making. For Emperor Hirohito, these years would see a steady increase in his involvement in Japan's aggressive expansionist policies, although his role remained largely symbolic in the public eye. In the early 1930s, Japan's foreign policy became increasingly focused on military expansion, particularly in Asia. The belief in Japan's divine right to lead Asia and its growing imperial ambitions were deeply embedded in the country's military culture. Hirohito, as the symbol of national unity and the embodiment of Japan's imperial heritage, was drawn further into these efforts, despite his largely ceremonial position. The military sought to justify its actions by appealing to the emperor's authority, using his image to legitimize the pursuit of national expansion. The road to World War II in the Pacific began to take shape as Japan's military aggression grew bolder. One of the earliest signs of this came in 1937, with the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War. Tensions between Japan and China had been simmering for years, and the Japanese invasion of China escalated into a full-scale war. The conflict marked the beginning of a long and brutal campaign for Japan, as it sought to expand its control over China and the broader East Asian region. Hirohito's involvement in the conflict was more complex than his early years as emperor had been. As Japan's military grew more powerful, the emperor found himself in a situation where his passive role was no longer sufficient to navigate the country's increasing militarization. Although Hirohito did not directly order military actions or make decisions regarding strategy, his role as emperor made his moral and symbolic support invaluable to the military. The early years of the Sino-Japanese War were marked by intense military actions and atrocities. Japanese forces, under the guise of securing Japan's interests in the region, engaged in widespread campaigns of violence against Chinese civilians. The most infamous of these was the Nanjing Massacre, which occurred in 1937. Over the course of several weeks, Japanese soldiers brutally massacred tens of thousands of Chinese civilians and prisoners of war. The massacre became one of the darkest chapters in Japan's wartime history and left an indelible stain on the country's legacy. As the war in China raged on, Hirohito's position became increasingly intertwined with Japan's military aggression. His approval was critical to the military's ambitions, and his image was used to bolster the legitimacy of the actions being taken by the government. Although he may not have been directly involved in the day-to-day military decisions, Hirohito's presence as emperor provided the military with a sense of unity and purpose. It was a relationship that grew more complicated as the war continued and the stakes became higher. Meanwhile, Japan's relationship with the Western powers, particularly the United States, was becoming more strained. In 1939, World War II broke out in Europe, and the conflict between the Allied powers and the Axis powers began to take shape. Japan, already aligned with Germany and Italy through the Tripartite Pact of 1940, found itself increasingly at odds with the United States and its allies. Japan's imperial ambitions, which had already been evident in its actions in China, were now extending to the Pacific region. The Japanese military began to push further southward, occupying French Indochina and threatening British colonies in Southeast Asia. The United States, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, became increasingly alarmed by Japan's expansionist actions. In response, the United States imposed an oil embargo on Japan, severely restricting the country's access to critical resources needed to fuel its military. This move brought Japan to the brink of economic collapse, and the government, led by military leaders, began to see war as the only viable option to secure the resources it needed for its survival. It was during this period of rising tension that Hirohito's involvement in the decisions leading to Japan's entry into World War II became more apparent. The military, desperate for resources, pushed for a preemptive strike against the United States, and the leadership began to consider an attack on the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. While Hirohito may not have ordered the attack directly, the military saw his moral authority as an important part of their campaign for war. In the months leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor, Hirohito was kept informed of the plans being made by his military leaders. Despite the growing uncertainty about the consequences of such a drastic step, Hirohito did not overtly challenge the military's decision. On December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack on the US naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The attack led to the United States' formal entry into World War II, and it marked the beginning of a new phase in the Pacific conflict. The decision to attack Pearl Harbor was one of the most significant events of Hirohito's reign. While he was not directly responsible for the planning of the attack, his involvement, both as a figurehead and symbol of the nation, lent the military's actions a sense of legitimacy. In the aftermath of the attack, Japan found itself in a state of war with the United States and its allies. The stakes of the conflict were now set at the highest possible level. For Hirohito, the attack on Pearl Harbor marked a dramatic turning point in his reign. Japan, once a regional power, was now embroiled in a global conflict with the world's most powerful nations. Hirohito's position was no longer one of passive observation. He was now part of a nation at war. However, it was still not entirely clear how active his role in Japan's military decisions would be. The military continued to hold significant power, and Hirohito's moral authority remained the primary form of his involvement in the conflict. In the days following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Hirohito's role as emperor became even more significant. His leadership was invoked as the nation braced for what would become a long and grueling war. The emperor's symbolic position remained central, even as Japan faced challenges on multiple fronts. Hirohito's reign, once defined by his passive role in governance, was now defined by his nation's desperate bid for survival in a war that would shape the future of Japan and the world. On December 7, 1941, Japan's military launched a surprise attack on the US naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, marking a decisive moment in the history of the Pacific conflict and a turning point in World War II. The attack, which resulted in the destruction of much of the US Pacific Fleet, led directly to the United States' formal entry into the war. The consequences of this attack were far-reaching, and for Japan, it marked the beginning of a full-scale war with the Western powers, especially the United States. For Emperor Hirohito, this moment was the culmination of years of rising tension between Japan and the Western powers, especially the United States, which had imposed an oil embargo on Japan in 1941. This embargo had significantly crippled Japan's access to essential resources, making it clear that war was approaching. Hirohito, as the emperor, had been kept informed of the military's intentions to strike the United States, but he did not directly order the attack. The decision was made by Japan's military leaders, including Prime Minister Hideki Tojo and the Imperial General Headquarters, who believed that Japan's only option for survival was to secure its place in the Pacific by disabling the US fleet. Hirohito's role in the decision-making process surrounding Pearl Harbor is a subject of historical debate. While there is no evidence to suggest that he directly ordered the attack, his position as emperor meant that his moral authority was crucial. The military in particular sought to justify their actions through Hirohito's symbolic leadership, as his approval provided a sense of legitimacy to the military's decisions. Hirohito's relationship with the military had always been one of delicate balance. He was deeply respectful of the military's role in protecting Japan's sovereignty, but had often remained removed from the day-to-day political decisions. This would change, however, as the war progressed, and Hirohito's role in the nation's direction became more involved. The attack on Pearl Harbor was executed with stunning precision. In the early hours of the morning, Japan's aircraft launched a series of coordinated strikes against the US fleet. The surprise attack caught the Americans off guard and resulted in devastating damage to the naval base. Over 2,400 Americans were killed, and much of the Pacific Fleet, including 8 battleships, was destroyed or damaged. The attack left a deep emotional scar on the United States, and it galvanized the American public, leading to the declaration of war against Japan the following day, December 8, 1941. The timing of the attack was critical. Japan believed that by crippling the US fleet, it could gain time to secure resources in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, areas rich in oil, rubber, and other valuable materials. However, the long-term consequences of the attack would prove to be disastrous for Japan. The attack on Pearl Harbor unified the United States in a way that no diplomatic effort had been able to achieve. It led to a declaration of war and set in motion the United States' mobilization for what would become a global conflict. For Hirohito, the aftermath of Pearl Harbor marked the beginning of a new chapter in his reign. Japan's military had made a bold and aggressive move, and now the country was fully committed to a war with the United States. Hirohito's role as emperor was now more intertwined with the decisions being made by his government and military leaders. While the emperor had remained largely symbolic during the early years of his reign, his moral authority was now crucial in maintaining national unity during the war. In the immediate aftermath of the attack, Japan experienced a brief period of triumph. The United States, though shocked by the attack, was not yet fully mobilized, and Japan's forces made significant gains in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The empire expanded rapidly, capturing territories such as the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and Dutch East Indies. The Japanese people, at least initially, were buoyed by the success of their military campaigns. Hirohito, who had always been a symbol of Japan's strength, was portrayed as a unifying figure during this time of national pride. However, despite the initial successes, the war began to take a heavy toll on Japan. The attack on Pearl Harbor was only the beginning of a series of military operations that would stretch Japan's resources to their limits. The military leadership, under pressure to secure further victories, continued to push for more aggressive actions. Hirohito, though not involved in the planning of specific military campaigns, was once again positioned as the symbolic center of Japan's war effort. His speeches and public appearances became more frequent, reinforcing the image of the emperor as the guiding figure behind Japan's wartime actions. One of the most significant aspects of Hirohito's role during the war was the way in which the military increasingly used his image to legitimize their decisions. Hirohito's divine status as the emperor was used to justify Japan's expansionist policies, and the military leaders sought to portray their actions as being in line with the emperor's will. This created a sense of unity and national purpose, but it also left Hirohito in a precarious position. While he was not directly responsible for the military's decisions, his image was intrinsically tied to the actions of the government. His moral authority was constantly called upon to support the war effort, even as the situation on the front lines grew increasingly dire. Despite the early successes, Japan's military situation began to deteriorate as the war dragged on. The United States, after recovering from the shock of Pearl Harbor, began to mobilize its vast industrial and military resources. Japan found itself increasingly stretched thin, fighting a war on multiple fronts. The American counterattacks, beginning with the Battle of Midway in June 1942, marked the beginning of a shift in the balance of power in the Pacific. Japan's military dominance began to wane, and the tide of war turned against them. For Hirohito, this shift in the war's fortunes presented a new challenge. As the war progressed, he was increasingly drawn into the difficult decisions that were being made regarding Japan's military strategy. While he'd always remained in the background, the military's failure to achieve a decisive victory began to place more pressure on the emperor to take a more active role in Japan's wartime policies. Hirohito, who had long sought to maintain a delicate balance between his symbolic role and the military's actions, now found himself in the midst of a growing crisis that would define the course of his reign. As the Pacific War raged on, the initial victories Japan achieved in the months following the attack on Pearl Harbor began to fade, and the situation for the Japanese Empire grew increasingly dire. Despite the early successes in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, Japan faced mounting difficulties as the war expanded. The battles became more intense, the casualties grew, and the military's strategic mistakes began to catch up with them. Emperor Hirohito, who had once been seen as a unifying figure, now found himself more deeply entwined in a war that was stretching Japan's resources to their limits. By 1942, the tide of the war began to shift decisively in favor of the United States. The Battle of Midway, fought in June of that year, was a major turning point. The US Navy delivered a crushing blow to the Japanese fleet, sinking 4 of its aircraft carriers and significantly weakening Japan's naval strength. This loss, along with the continuing Allied push in the Pacific, signaled a dramatic shift in momentum. Japan's aggressive territorial expansion, which had seemed unstoppable just a year earlier, was now being reversed. For Hirohito, this change in the war's fortunes was sobering. His role as emperor was one of national unity, and his image continued to be used by the military to rally the people. However, the growing toll of war on both the military and civilians was becoming more evident. Japan was running out of resources, and the ongoing conflict was taking a heavy toll on the civilian population. This strain of war, combined with mounting losses, led to increasing criticism of Japan's leadership, both at home and abroad. Hirohito, though often described as a figurehead during this period, was far from passive in the face of the war's escalation. His involvement in military decision-making was limited, but his moral authority remained crucial, as Japan's military leaders pushed forward with aggressive tactics and strategies. Hirohito's endorsement of these actions was important to maintaining national unity. However, as the situation worsened, Hirohito found himself in a delicate position. While the military leaders continued to push for more aggressive action, the emperor was aware of the increasingly dire situation facing Japan. One of the most significant events during this period was the Battle of Okinawa, which took place in the spring and summer of 1945. The battle was one of the bloodiest of the war, with heavy casualties on both sides. The Japanese military, determined to hold on to the island at all costs, launched a fierce defense against the Allied forces. Despite their efforts, the battle ended in a decisive Allied victory. The loss of Okinawa marked the beginning of Japan's vulnerability to Allied forces and demonstrated the increasing strength of the United States in the Pacific theater. In the wake of the defeat at Okinawa, the United States began its strategy of island hopping, bypassing heavily fortified islands and moving closer to Japan's home islands. The American bombing campaign, which had already targeted Japanese cities, intensified. In 1944 and 1945, US bombers began to carry out large-scale raids on Japan's industrial centers, with devastating effects. The most infamous of these raids was the firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945, which resulted in the destruction of much of the city and the loss of tens of thousands of lives. The bombing raids had a profound impact on the Japanese population. Hirohito, who had always been a symbol of unity for the Japanese people, now faced the reality of widespread devastation. The emperor's role was one of moral and symbolic leadership, but the physical toll of the war was inescapable. Japan's cities were being reduced to rubble, and the civilian population was enduring immense suffering. Hirohito, who had long held the belief that Japan's military efforts were justified, now had to come to terms with the fact that the war was costing his people dearly. Throughout the war, Hirohito maintained his public image as a symbol of hope and perseverance. His speeches and public appearances were intended to bolster the morale of the people and keep the nation united in the face of adversity. However, as the war continued and the military's failures mounted, the emperor's position became more precarious. He was increasingly seen as the figurehead of a war that seemed to have no end in sight. The Japanese people, many of whom had been led to believe in the righteousness of their cause, were now confronted with the harsh reality of the war's toll. In 1945, as the war entered its final stages, the Japanese leadership faced a growing sense of urgency. The United States was closing in on Japan's home islands, and the prospect of a full-scale invasion loomed large. Japan's military leaders, despite the mounting evidence of defeat, continued to push for a fight to the bitter end. Hirohito, whose role had always been one of symbolic leadership, now found himself facing the most difficult decision of his reign. In the face of the worsening situation, Hirohito began to reconsider Japan's path forward. His awareness of the devastating impact of the war on the Japanese people and the growing threat posed by the Allied forces led him to consider the possibility of peace. However, Hirohito was not the sole decision-maker in Japan's government. The military's influence was still strong, and many of Japan's leaders were unwilling to accept defeat. The war had become not only a military conflict but a battle for national pride and honor, and many of Japan's leaders were determined to fight to the end, even if it meant further destruction. As the war continued to spiral out of control, Hirohito faced the pressure of deciding whether to pursue peace or to continue the fight. This decision would ultimately come to a head in the summer of 1945, as Japan faced the looming threat of the atomic bomb. The war had reached a point where Hirohito could no longer remain a passive observer. His role as emperor, once largely ceremonial, had now become central to the future of Japan and its people. As the Pacific War continued to escalate, the Allied forces led by the United States stepped up their bombing campaigns against Japan's industrial and civilian centers. By 1944 and 1945, the United States had begun a series of relentless air raids aimed at crippling Japan's ability to wage war. While these bombings initially targeted military and industrial infrastructure, by 1945 the raids became increasingly focused on civilian areas, with the intent of breaking the Japanese spirit and forcing the government to surrender. One of the most devastating events of this bombing campaign was the firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945. The raid was conducted by US B-29 Superfortress bombers, which dropped incendiary bombs on the heart of the city. The results were catastrophic. Vast portions of Tokyo were set ablaze, and the fires that spread through the densely packed residential areas killed an estimated 100,000 people, mostly civilians. It was one of the deadliest single air raids of the war, and a stark illustration of the destruction Japan was experiencing as a result of its ongoing military efforts. The firebombing of Tokyo was not an isolated incident. It was part of a broader strategy by the United States to destroy Japan's cities, cripple its economy, and break the morale of the Japanese population. Over the next several months, American bombers targeted other major Japanese cities, including Osaka, Nagoya, and Kobe. The raids, combined with the growing naval blockade, placed immense pressure on Japan's civilian infrastructure. The country was slowly being starved into submission, and the people of Japan were bearing the brunt of the war's devastation. For Emperor Hirohito, the firebombing of Tokyo marked a grim turning point in the war. While Japan had been on the defensive for some time, the scale of the destruction was a clear signal that the war was no longer simply about military victories. It was now a struggle for national survival. The civilian population, which had largely been shielded from the worst effects of the conflict in its early years, was now directly experiencing the horrors of war. The bombing raids and the devastation they caused left the Japanese people deeply shaken, and Hirohito, as their symbol of unity, was confronted with the reality of the situation. In the wake of the Tokyo firebombing, Hirohito's role as emperor was more crucial than ever. His image was invoked by the government to rally the people, and his speeches were meant to encourage perseverance and resolve. However, Hirohito could not ignore the increasingly dire circumstances surrounding Japan. The country's infrastructure was crumbling, its military was on the retreat, and its people were suffering. Hirohito, though still a figurehead, had to contend with the moral implications of continuing a war that was causing so much destruction to his country. The firebombing of Tokyo and the subsequent raids across Japan highlighted the growing futility of Japan's military campaign. As American forces closed in on Japan from the Pacific Islands, the prospect of a full-scale invasion of the Japanese home island seemed imminent. In the face of this impending invasion, Hirohito was forced to consider the unthinkable: peace. The question now was whether Japan could continue to resist, or whether it should seek an end to the conflict. The bombing raids also had a profound effect on Japan's leadership. Hirohito, who had largely remained in the background during the earlier phases of the war, began to play a more active role in the deliberations surrounding Japan's future. His moral authority was vital in guiding the nation, and his image continued to serve as a source of inspiration for the Japanese people. However, Hirohito was increasingly aware that the war could not continue without further devastation. As Japan's cities were reduced to rubble, Hirohito found himself caught between his duty to his people and the military's insistence on fighting to the bitter end. At the same time, Japan's political leadership was in disarray. The military, which had gained significant power in the years preceding the war, was now divided. Some military leaders still believed that Japan should fight on, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Others, however, recognized the futility of continuing the war and began to call for negotiations with the Allies. Hirohito, while maintaining his role as emperor, had little direct power over military strategy, but he was increasingly drawn into the decision-making process as Japan's situation worsened. Despite the growing pressure to surrender, Japan's military leaders remained committed to the idea of a decisive battle that could turn the tide of the war. This mentality was rooted in the belief that Japan's honor and survival depended on resisting foreign forces to the end. However, the war had already reached a point where it was clear that Japan's resources were insufficient to win. The firebombing raids, coupled with the looming threat of a US invasion, made it clear that Japan's situation was untenable. Hirohito, though still reluctant to intervene directly in the military's decisions, began to recognize that Japan's survival depended on seeking peace. The devastation of the firebombing raids, combined with the pressure from the military's strategic failures, made it increasingly clear that Japan could not continue the war. Yet the question remained: how could Japan surrender without losing its honor? Hirohito faced the monumental challenge of reconciling the need for peace with the cultural and ideological pressures that had defined Japan's military campaign. In the summer of 1945, as the war neared its end, the United States dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These bombings, coupled with the Soviet Union's declaration of war against Japan, sealed the fate of the Japanese Empire. The horrific destruction wrought by the atomic bombs forced Japan's leadership to confront the reality of their situation. Hirohito, who had watched as his country was devastated by conventional bombing, now faced the moral and political responsibility of deciding Japan's future in the face of the atomic age. By the summer of 1945, Japan was on the brink of total collapse. The relentless bombing campaigns had destroyed much of the country's infrastructure. The military had suffered defeat after defeat, and the once proud imperial forces were now in retreat. The Allied forces, led by the United States, had succeeded in isolating Japan, and the prospect of an invasion of the home islands was imminent. It was clear to Japan's leadership, including Emperor Hirohito, that the country could no longer continue to fight. In the final stages of the war, two events would force Hirohito and Japan's leadership to confront the reality of defeat. The first was the devastating atomic bombing of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. The second came just 3 days later, with the bombing of Nagasaki on August 9th. These bombings, the first ever use of atomic weapons in warfare, brought unprecedented destruction to Japan's cities. Hiroshima was almost completely obliterated, with over 70,000 people killed instantly, and the death toll would rise in the weeks and months to come as radiation sickness took its toll. Nagasaki suffered a similar fate, with the immediate loss of thousands of lives and many more in the aftermath. The sheer scale of the destruction caused by the bombs was unlike anything the world had ever seen. For Emperor Hirohito, the bombings were a devastating blow. By this point, Japan's military leadership had already been divided on the question of surrender. Some factions within the military, particularly those that had been advocating for a fight to the bitter end, resisted any notion of peace. Others, however, were beginning to recognize the futility of continuing the war. The atomic bombings pushed Japan's leadership to a critical juncture, and Hirohito, as the symbol of national unity, was now forced to make a decision that would shape the future of Japan and the world. Hirohito's role in the decision to surrender was complicated. As emperor, he had the moral authority to bring an end to the war, but his power was largely symbolic. The real power in Japan was still in the hands of the military and political elite, many of whom were reluctant to accept defeat. Even after the bombing, some military leaders pushed for continued resistance, believing that Japan could still achieve a favorable peace through negotiation or by holding out until the very last moment. The traditional notion of saving face and maintaining Japan's honor weighed heavily on these leaders. However, Hirohito, who had witnessed the suffering of his people and understood the devastating impact of the war, was increasingly inclined to end the conflict. The atomic bombings, coupled with the Soviet Union's declaration of war on Japan and the subsequent invasion of Manchuria, made it clear that Japan's survival was at stake. The emperor was deeply aware that Japan could no longer resist the overwhelming military power of the Allies. Hirohito, in consultation with his closest advisors, came to the painful realization that the only way to preserve Japan's future was to seek peace. On August 15, 1945, Hirohito made the unprecedented decision to surrender. This was the first time in Japan's history that an emperor had addressed the nation directly, and the speech he delivered was one of the most significant moments of his reign. The emperor's voice, calm and measured, came over the radio waves, and for the first time the Japanese people heard their emperor speak of surrender. In his speech, Hirohito cited the most cruel bomb and the new and most terrible weapon as the reasons for Japan's decision to end the war. He spoke of the suffering that the Japanese people had endured and expressed the hope that peace could be restored. The emperor's speech marked the official end of World War II for Japan, but it was also a moment of profound personal and national reflection. For Hirohito, it was a moment of reckoning. He had presided over a nation that had gone from military glory to utter devastation. His decision to surrender, though carefully considered and executed, was not an easy one. Hirohito had always been seen as the symbol of Japan's strength, but now, as the war ended in defeat, he would also be the symbol of Japan's submission to the Allied powers. In the wake of Japan's surrender, Hirohito faced an uncertain future. The country had been devastated both physically and psychologically, and the post-war occupation of Japan by the Allied forces, led by General Douglas MacArthur, would fundamentally alter the country's political structure. Hirohito's role as emperor was called into question, and many feared that he would be removed from the throne. There were calls from some Allied leaders, particularly those in the United States, to try Hirohito for war crimes, given his position as the head of state during Japan's military aggression. However, MacArthur, recognizing the importance of the emperor in maintaining order and stability in post-war Japan, decided against prosecuting Hirohito. Instead, Hirohito remained on the throne, but his role was radically altered. Under the new constitution, which was imposed by the Allied forces, Japan became a constitutional monarchy, and the emperor's power was stripped of any political authority. Hirohito's role was now purely symbolic, and he was no longer seen as a divine figure. The new constitution, which came into effect in 1947, enshrined the sovereignty of the Japanese people and reduced the emperor to a ceremonial head of state, with no power over the government or military. For Hirohito, this was a time of profound change. The emperor had once been seen as the central figure of Japan's national identity, but now he was a symbol of continuity in a nation that had been thoroughly transformed. Hirohito's role in post-war Japan was one of reconciliation and rebuilding. He became a figurehead in the nation's recovery, working to maintain the stability of the monarchy, while also adjusting to the new political realities of post-war Japan. His symbolic role, though stripped of political power, helped to unify the nation as it navigated the challenges of reconstruction. In the years following the surrender, Hirohito was able to maintain a relatively low profile, but his legacy as a symbol of Japan's defeat and recovery would remain for decades to come. He would live to see Japan become a leading economic power once again, but the memory of the war and his role in it would continue to shape the country's identity long after his reign ended. With Japan's surrender and the end of World War II, the country entered a new and difficult chapter in its history. The devastation of the war, the destruction of its cities, the loss of millions of lives, and the shame of defeat left Japan in a state of profound crisis. Emperor Hirohito, who had once been the embodiment of Japan's imperial might, was now a symbol of national survival. His role, however, had changed drastically. His power was stripped away by the new post-war constitution, and his position was now purely ceremonial, a mere figurehead in a transformed political landscape. The Japanese people, who had been deeply loyal to their emperor for generations, were now faced with the painful reality of their country's defeat. Yet Hirohito's position was crucial in the process of rebuilding Japan and stabilizing the nation after its surrender. While his role as emperor had been deeply tied to Japan's imperial ambitions during the war, he now became a unifying figure as Japan transitioned from a militaristic state to a peace-oriented nation. Under the guidance of the Allied forces led by General Douglas MacArthur, Japan underwent a complete overhaul of its political system. The Meiji Constitution, which had governed Japan since the late 19th century, was replaced by a new constitution in 1947. The new constitution enshrined the sovereignty of the people and stripped the emperor of any political power. Hirohito, once seen as a divine ruler, was now relegated to a purely symbolic role, with no involvement in the governance of the country. The emperor's new role was defined by Article 1 of the Constitution, which declared that the emperor shall be the symbol of the state and of the unity of the people. While Hirohito's direct power had been nullified, his presence remained significant. The Japanese people still saw him as a unifying figure, and his position as emperor provided a sense of continuity and stability in a time of profound upheaval. His actions in the immediate post-war years were carefully watched, and his speeches, though rare, carried great weight. In particular, Hirohito's public address to the nation after Japan's surrender had been a moment of profound significance, and now, in the aftermath of the war, he worked to help Japan transition into its new role as a peaceful nation in the international community. One of Hirohito's early tasks in post-war Japan was to address the issue of war responsibility, the question of whether he, as the head of state during Japan's wartime aggression, should be held accountable for the atrocities committed during the conflict, was a matter of great debate. The Japanese people, many of whom had revered Hirohito as a divine figure, struggled to reconcile their loyalty to the emperor with the realities of the war's devastating consequences. While some advocated for Hirohito to be tried as a war criminal, General MacArthur made the decision not to pursue legal action against him. MacArthur believed that Hirohito's role in the war had been largely ceremonial, and that removing him from the throne could destabilize the country. Instead, the emperor was allowed to remain in power, but his role was drastically altered. Hirohito was no longer a symbol of military power and conquest. He became a symbol of peace and reconciliation, a figurehead who would guide Japan through the process of recovery. In the early post-war years, Hirohito's role was largely focused on maintaining stability and reassuring the Japanese people that their country could rebuild. His visits to areas affected by the war, his symbolic gestures of unity, and his commitment to Japan's peaceful future helped to ease the national psyche, even though the scars of war remained deeply etched in the collective memory of the population. Hirohito's continued presence as emperor, despite the significant changes to his role, gave the Japanese people a sense of continuity and connection to their past. One of the most significant aspects of Hirohito's post-war leadership was his public support for Japan's new constitution. In 1947, when the new constitution was adopted, Hirohito made it clear that he supported the changes, despite the reduction of his power. This support was crucial for ensuring that the transition to a constitutional monarchy was smooth and accepted by the Japanese people. Hirohito's endorsement of the constitution signified his commitment to Japan's transformation and the establishment of a democratic government. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Japan underwent a remarkable transformation. The country, once devastated by war, emerged as one of the world's leading economic powers. The rebuilding process was aided by the United States, which provided significant economic assistance through the US, occupation, as well as the support of the broader international community. Japan's economy boomed, and the country's industrial and technological advancements allowed it to become a key player in global commerce. Hirohito, as emperor, played a symbolic role in this transformation. His visits to various countries and his participation in international diplomacy helped to re-establish Japan's presence on the world stage. In 1952, after the end of the Allied occupation, Hirohito visited the United States, where he was warmly received by the American public. This visit was seen as a gesture of reconciliation and marked the beginning of Japan's reintegration into the international community after the long years of war. In addition to his symbolic role in Japan's recovery, Hirohito also became more involved in scientific and cultural pursuits. His lifelong interest in marine biology, which had begun in his youth, continued throughout his reign. Hirohito's work in marine biology and his contributions to the field were recognized internationally. His scientific endeavors, along with his symbolic role as a stabilizing figure in post-war Japan, helped to create a new image of the emperor, one that was more closely associated with peace, progress, and Japan's place in the modern world. Throughout the post-war period, Hirohito continued to embody the ideals of peace and unity. His role as emperor was largely ceremonial, but his presence provided a sense of continuity and connection to Japan's past. Hirohito's leadership during the post-war years was defined not by political power, but by his ability to guide Japan through one of the most difficult and transformative periods in its history. As Japan's economy continued to grow and the country became a leading global power, Hirohito's symbolic role as emperor remained central to Japan's identity. His quiet but steady presence helped to anchor the nation's transformation, and he became a symbol of the resilience and perseverance of the Japanese people. By the time of his death in 1989, Hirohito had witnessed Japan's remarkable recovery from the ashes of war to become a prosperous, peaceful, and democratic nation. As Japan emerged from the ashes of World War II, the question of responsibility for the war's devastation loomed large. While the Allies had set their sights on prosecuting the leaders of Nazi Germany at the Nuremberg trials, Japan's war crimes trials were a separate but equally significant event. The trials were held to bring justice to those responsible for atrocities committed during Japan's military aggression, particularly in China and throughout Southeast Asia. The debate over whether Emperor Hirohito should be held accountable for his role in Japan's wartime actions was one of the most controversial aspects of the post-war era. Though Hirohito was not directly involved in the military decisions that led to war, his position as emperor and the symbolic role he played in legitimizing Japan's imperial ambitions made him a figure of interest to the Allies. The question that loomed was whether Hirohito, as the head of state, bore responsibility for the crimes committed during the war. Some Allied leaders, particularly in the United States, pushed for Hirohito to be tried as a war criminal, but others, notably General Douglas MacArthur, who was overseeing the occupation of Japan, saw the emperor's value as a stabilizing force for the nation. MacArthur, in a controversial decision, chose to allow Hirohito to remain on the throne, believing that his continued presence would help ensure a smooth transition from a militaristic state to a peaceful, democratic Japan. The decision not to prosecute Hirohito was not without its critics. Many Japanese citizens, as well as international observers, felt that the emperor should face responsibility for his role in the war. Some argued that Hirohito was a more active participant in Japan's wartime policies than he had let on. Others believed that holding him accountable was essential to Japan's moral reckoning after the war. The controversy surrounding Hirohito's status as emperor would continue to haunt Japan's post-war years, and it shaped his legacy in the decades to come. Ultimately, Hirohito was not tried for war crimes. Instead, he was granted immunity as part of the US-led occupation. His survival was seen as a necessary condition for the rebuilding of Japan, as his symbolic role as emperor provided a sense of continuity in a country torn apart by war. The Allies, particularly MacArthur, believed that Hirohito could play an important role in ensuring Japan's peaceful recovery, and his position as a figurehead would help avoid the potential destabilization of the country. While Hirohito's involvement in Japan's wartime policies was limited, his symbolic role in supporting the military's actions had significant consequences. His speeches and public endorsements of Japan's expansionist policies were used to legitimize the war effort. Hirohito's divine status, as a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu in Shinto belief, was invoked to rally the Japanese people behind the military's ambitions. In this sense, Hirohito was seen as both a symbol of the nation's strength and an instrument of its militaristic ideology. After Japan's surrender, Hirohito made efforts to distance himself from the war's atrocities. He publicly renounced his divinity, a significant shift from the traditional belief that the emperor was a living god. Hirohito's abdication of his divine status was a major part of Japan's post-war transformation, and it marked the beginning of a new era in which the emperor would no longer be seen as a godlike figure but as a symbolic leader of the people. His renunciation of divinity, though not an apology, was an important step toward Japan's democratization and the acceptance of responsibility for the war. In the years following Japan's surrender, Hirohito remained largely quiet about his role during the war. He never publicly took responsibility for Japan's wartime actions, nor did he express regret for the suffering caused by the military's aggression. However, he did make efforts to promote peace and reconciliation. Hirohito's visits to other countries, such as his trip to the United States in 1975, symbolized Japan's reintegration into the international community, and marked a shift toward a more peaceful and cooperative foreign policy. Hirohito's legacy was complex and in many ways contradictory. On one hand, he was a symbol of continuity and stability for the Japanese people during a time of immense hardship. His reign spanned both the rise of Japan as a global power and its eventual defeat in the war, and his survival was seen as essential to Japan's recovery. On the other hand, Hirohito was also the figurehead of a nation that had committed horrific atrocities during the war. While he was never held personally responsible for these crimes, his association with Japan's militaristic past remained a shadow over his reign. The emperor's role in Japan's war crimes trials and the broader question of accountability for Japan's wartime actions were central to the post-war debate about Japan's moral and political future. Some historians and commentators argue that Hirohito's refusal to confront his role in the war, coupled with the US decision to shield him from prosecution, allowed Japan to avoid fully grappling with the consequences of its actions. Others saw Hirohito as a figure who'd been caught in the tide of history, a leader who was constrained by the decisions of Japan's military elite and unable to stop the country's descent into war. In the decades that followed, Hirohito's legacy was shaped by Japan's dramatic economic recovery and its transformation into a peaceful and democratic nation. His reign saw Japan become one of the world's leading economic powers, and his symbolic role as emperor continued to serve as a stabilizing force in the country's political life. However, His wartime legacy remained a contentious issue, particularly in the context of Japan's relations with its neighbors, especially China and South Korea. The memory of Japan's wartime aggression, including the atrocities committed by Japanese soldiers, continued to shape diplomatic relations in the post-war period. Hirohito's death in 1989 marked the end of an era. His son, Akihito, succeeded him as emperor, bringing a new chapter to the Japanese imperial family. While Hirohito's legacy remained a subject of debate, his reign had helped guide Japan through its darkest days and into the modern era. His symbolic role as emperor in the post-war period was a key factor in Japan's recovery, and his leadership, while fraught with controversy, helped shape the trajectory of the nation's peaceful future. After the conclusion of World War II and Japan's surrender in 1945, Emperor Hirohito faced a radically different role. Once a figurehead of militaristic expansion, Hirohito was now tasked with symbolizing Japan's transition to peace and democracy. His direct involvement in the day-to-day politics of the country had diminished, but his symbolic importance remained paramount as Japan navigated its post-war recovery. His reign, now defined by peaceful governance and symbolic unity, spanned a time of dramatic change as Japan became an economic powerhouse and his role as emperor took on new meaning. From the 1950s onward, Japan began its rapid recovery, aided by US economic support and the rebuilding efforts that followed the end of the war. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, served as a catalyst for Japan's economic boom as the US used Japan as a base for military operations which injected large amounts of capital into the country. This period is often referred to as the beginning of Japan's economic miracle, a time when Japan's economy grew at an astonishing rate, making it one of the leading industrial nations in the world by the 1960s. Hirohito, despite his loss of political power, played a key role in guiding the nation through this transformation. While he no longer wielded influence in the government, his status as a national symbol was critical in maintaining unity in a country that had been ravaged by war. As Japan's industrial output grew, Hirohito made several public gestures to support the reconstruction efforts. He visited factories, attended major cultural events, and often spoke about the importance of peace, prosperity, and the Japanese spirit of resilience. In the 1950s, Hirohito's role became more defined by his diplomatic engagements. One of the most significant milestones during this period was his visit to the United States in 1975, marking the first time a reigning Japanese emperor had ever visited the US. This visit was a remarkable moment in both Japan-US relations and in Hirohito's post-war image. The emperor's visit symbolized Japan's reintegration into the international community and reinforced the idea that Japan had fully recovered from its wartime past. During his trip, Hirohito met with President Gerald Ford, and the visit was viewed as an important step in normalizing relations between the two countries after the devastating events of the war. At home, Hirohito continued to embody the nation's symbolic unity. He refrained from expressing political opinions and focused primarily on his role as a representative of the people. He presided over national ceremonies, attended state functions, and made visits to cultural and educational institutions. His public appearances, though few, were highly symbolic, and his demeanor as a figurehead who bridged the past with the present became a defining characteristic of his later years. However, Hirohito's personal life continued to be shaped by the legacy of the war. The emperor's role in Japan's wartime aggression remained a sensitive topic, particularly in the context of Japan's relations with its neighbors. The atrocities committed by the Japanese military during the war, including the Nanjing massacre and the treatment of prisoners of war, were still fresh in the memories of many, especially in China and Korea. The question of whether Hirohito bore responsibility for Japan's wartime actions continued to be debated in the post-war years, even as his role as a symbol of peace became more established. In Japan itself, the emperor remained a beloved figure, albeit a symbolic one. While Hirohito's political authority had been stripped away, the Japanese people continued to view him with reverence. The emperor was a central figure in national life, and his presence offered a sense of continuity in a country that had undergone profound transformation. As the nation rebuilt, Hirohito became an anchor for the Japanese identity, especially as the country gained international stature and respect. Hirohito's interest in marine biology, which had been a lifelong passion, also played a significant role in his post-war life. He continued to pursue scientific endeavors, conducting research and contributing to various marine science institutions. Hirohito's work in marine biology, particularly his research into the sea life around Japan, was well regarded internationally. His scientific achievements, while not politically significant, added to the image of the emperor as a thoughtful and dedicated figure, dedicated to both the peace of his country and the pursuit of knowledge. In the 1970s and 1980s, as Japan continued to experience rapid economic growth, Hirohito's role remained largely symbolic. His responsibilities were focused on ceremonial duties, public appearances, and fostering Japan's relationship with the outside world. While he had no direct power over the nation's policies or military, his presence was essential to maintaining the country's sense of unity and pride. Japan's rise to become an economic superpower in the post-war era was, in many ways, a testament to the resilience of its people, and Hirohito's continued role as emperor served as a symbol of that resilience. However, the emperor's role was also viewed in a new light in the context of Japan's growing global influence. Hirohito became a respected figure on the world stage, and his diplomatic visits helped solidify Japan's standing as a key player in global politics and economics. His reign marked a time when Japan went from being a nation scarred by war to a leading force in the international community. Hirohito's legacy as a symbol of peace, recovery, and national unity became solidified during this period. Despite the prosperity Japan enjoyed during Hirohito's later years, his health began to decline in the 1980s. By the late 1980s, Hirohito was in his late 80s, and his health was failing. He continued to perform his ceremonial duties but was increasingly restricted by his deteriorating health. In January 1989, Hirohito died after a long battle with cancer, and the nation mourned the passing of its emperor. His death marked the end of an era in Japanese history. When Emperor Hirohito passed away on January 7, 1989, the nation of Japan faced both grief and a turning point in its long history. Hirohito's death marked the end of a reign that had spanned over 6 decades, a period that had seen Japan transformed from an imperial power engaged in warfare to a peaceful, democratic, and economically prosperous nation. His son, Crown Prince Akihito, ascended the throne, becoming Japan's 125th emperor. This transition from father to son was not just a change in leadership. It represented the evolution of the Japanese monarchy from the figurehead of a militaristic empire to the symbol of a modern, peaceful nation. Hirohito's passing also marked the end of an era in which the emperor had been the central figure in Japan's national identity. The emperor was now firmly embedded in the role of a ceremonial leader, representing unity and the continuity of the Japanese people. Though Hirohito had been instrumental in Japan's post-war recovery, it was Akihito, the new emperor, who would embody Japan's future in a world increasingly focused on diplomacy, international relations, and peace. Akihito's ascension to the throne was a pivotal moment in the history of the Japanese imperial family. Unlike his father, who had faced immense challenges as the emperor of a nation at war, Akihito's reign began in a time of stability and growth. Japan had not only recovered from the devastation of the war, but had emerged as one of the world's leading economic powers. Akihito's early years as emperor were marked by his efforts to build bridges between Japan and its neighbours, as well as his ongoing dedication to the ideals of peace and diplomacy. His reign signalled a continuation of the themes that had defined his father's later years: peace, reconciliation, and the promotion of Japan as a constructive member of the international community. For the Japanese people, Hirohito's death was a moment of reflection. The emperor had witnessed Japan's rise to power, its fall into destruction, and its remarkable recovery. Hirohito had been a symbol of both Japan's imperial glory and its painful defeat, and his role as a symbol of national unity had been crucial in Japan's post-war transformation. His decisions, while often made in consultation with military and political leaders, were ultimately seen as representing Japan's spirit. Hirohito had not only been the emperor during Japan's most turbulent times, but had also played a part in rebuilding the nation after its defeat. Despite the fact that Hirohito's reign had ended, his legacy continued to shape the identity of the Japanese monarchy and the country as a whole. Hirohito had steered Japan through the horrors of war and played a key role in its transition to a peaceful and prosperous nation. In the years following his death, Hirohito's image remained closely associated with Japan's post-war recovery. His decision to surrender in 1945 has been pivotal in ending the war, and his renunciation of his divinity had been an essential part of Japan's transformation into a constitutional monarchy. However, Hirohito's legacy was not without controversy. While many Japanese continued to revere him as a symbol of stability and unity, others could not forget the atrocities committed during Japan's wartime expansion. Hirohito's role in the war had remained a subject of debate for decades, and his failure to fully address Japan's war crimes in his public speeches contributed to a lingering sense of discomfort about his leadership during the conflict. For many, Hirohito was a figure of ambiguity, an emperor who was both a symbol of national pride and a reminder of Japan's imperial aggression. In the years after his death, scholars and historians continued to examine Hirohito's wartime role and his involvement in Japan's military decisions. Some maintained that Hirohito had been a passive figurehead, unable or unwilling to stop the military's actions, while others argued that he had been complicit in the decisions that led Japan into war. The debate over Hirohito's legacy remains one of the most contentious aspects of Japanese history, particularly in relation to Japan's relationships with its neighbours, such as China and South Korea. The memory of Japan's wartime actions continued to shape diplomatic relations in the post-war era, and Hirohito's legacy was closely tied to these ongoing discussions. Despite the complexities of his wartime legacy, Hirohito's later years were marked by his efforts to promote peace and unity. He became a figurehead for Japan's peaceful future, and his efforts to heal the wounds of war were widely recognized. Hirohito's symbolic role in Japan's post-war recovery remained central to the country's identity, and his image was often used to reinforce the idea that Japan was a nation of peace and resilience. As the emperor, Hirohito personified Japan's ability to overcome adversity, and he remained a steadfast symbol of continuity throughout the rebuilding process. When Hirohito passed away in 1989, the transition to Akihito's reign was a time of both mourning and reflection. Akihito's ascension marked the beginning of a new chapter for the imperial family and for Japan itself. As the emperor, Akihito inherited not only the legacy of his father but also the responsibilities of leading Japan into the 21st century. While Hirohito's reign had been defined by Japan's turbulent past, Akihito's reign would be defined by Japan's peaceful present and future. Akihito, like his father, took on the role of a symbolic leader, but his approach to the role was distinct. He focused on engaging with the world beyond Japan, seeking to promote peace and understanding between Japan and its neighbours. He visited countries that had suffered under Japan's wartime aggression, including China and South Korea, and expressed deep remorse for the suffering caused by Japan's actions during the war. His gestures of reconciliation helped to heal some of the wounds left by Japan's imperial past, and Akihito's reign was marked by a sense of humility and compassion. As the decades passed after World War II, Emperor Hirohito's role as a symbol of peace and stability within Japan became more entrenched, but his personal reflections on the legacy of his reign remained deeply private. The emperor had led Japan through the nation's most tumultuous period, and his transition from a figurehead in a militaristic empire to a symbolic leader of a peaceful, democratic country was nothing short of extraordinary. But as he approached the twilight years of his reign, Hirohito was increasingly aware of the complexities and controversies that had shaped his legacy, particularly surrounding Japan's wartime actions. Hirohito's reign began with the rise of Japan as a global power, but it was overshadowed by the tragic consequences of the Pacific War, which culminated in Japan's defeat and occupation. Despite the drastic changes Japan underwent after the war, Hirohito continued to serve as a stabilizing force for the nation. By the 1970s, Japan had fully recovered from the devastation of war and had risen to become one of the world's leading economic powers. It was during this period of economic prosperity that Hirohito's role as emperor became more ceremonial and less politically active, in line with the new constitution that had stripped the emperor of his governing powers. While Hirohito's personal involvement in politics was minimal in the post-war years, his image remained central to Japan's national identity. His role in supporting Japan's transition from a war-torn nation to a peaceful democracy became a key part of his legacy. The emperor's symbolic presence during this time reinforced the sense of continuity for the Japanese people, providing them with a figure of unity and strength as the nation rebuilt itself. However, as Hirohito aged, the question of his legacy and his responsibility for Japan's wartime actions continued to hover over his reign. Despite the shift in his role after the war, the emperor's connection to the militaristic ideology of the pre-war era and his symbolic association with the wartime leadership made him a figure of both reverence and controversy. While Hirohito was widely regarded as a symbol of peace during the post-war era, especially following his renunciation of his divine status, the scars of Japan's imperial past were not easily forgotten. Many neighbouring countries, particularly China and Korea, continued to grapple with the atrocities committed by Japan during the war. The emperor's failure to fully apologize for the suffering caused by Japan's military expansion remained a contentious issue, even as Japan moved into the late 20th century. Hirohito's reflections on his role in Japan's wartime actions remained private. He never offered a direct public apology for Japan's wartime crimes, nor did he address the full extent of his involvement in the decisions that led to the war. Some historians argue that Hirohito, as emperor, played a larger role in Japan's military aggression than he let on, while others contend that he was largely a figurehead who had little control over the decisions of his military leaders. Regardless of the truth, Hirohito's failure to publicly address Japan's wartime atrocities created a lingering sense of ambiguity around his legacy. In his later years, Hirohito's health began to decline. As he aged, the emperor became increasingly frail, and by the mid-1980s his public appearances became less frequent. Despite his declining health, Hirohito continued to fulfill his ceremonial duties, presiding over state functions and national events. His role remained a unifying force for the Japanese people, and his presence continued to symbolize Japan's post-war recovery and its transformation into a peaceful nation. However, the demands of the office became more difficult for Hirohito to manage as he aged, and by the time of his death in 1989, the emperor had been largely confined to a ceremonial role for several years. Hirohito's passing in January 1989 marked the end of an era. He had ruled Japan for over 6 decades, experiencing its rise to power, its descent into war, and its eventual recovery. The emperor's death was a moment of national mourning, and it marked the end of a reign that had witnessed both Japan's imperial glory and its tragic defeat. His son, Crown Prince Akihito, succeeded him on the throne, ushering in a new era for the imperial family and the nation. Akihito's reign would continue the themes of peace and reconciliation that Hirohito had symbolized in his later years, but the transition from father to son also marked a generational shift in Japan's monarchy. Hirohito's legacy remained complicated both within Japan and abroad. For many Japanese, the emperor was a symbol of continuity and resilience, a figure who had led the country through its darkest days and had remained a symbol of unity as Japan recovered. Hirohito was deeply respected by the Japanese people, who saw him as a representation of the nation's strength and recovery after the war. However, outside Japan, particularly in countries that had suffered at Japan's hands during the war, his legacy remained a source of tension. In China and Korea, the memory of Japan's wartime aggression was still fresh, and Hirohito's failure to fully come to terms with Japan's actions left a sense of unresolved grief. In the years following his death, Hirohito's role in Japan's wartime actions continued to be a subject of debate. Some historians argue that Hirohito should have done more to prevent Japan's aggressive policies, while others contend that he was constrained by the military's dominance during his reign. Regardless of the perspective, Hirohito's reign left a lasting impact on Japan's history. He'd been both a symbol of Japan's imperial ambitions and a symbol of the nation's survival after the war. Hirohito's legacy remains tied to both the nation's rise and its fall, and the lessons of his reign continue to shape Japan's identity in the post-war era. The decades following Emperor Hirohito's death in 1989 saw a significant transformation in the Japanese monarchy and the nation's identity. As Hirohito's reign came to a close, Japan had already undergone a remarkable metamorphosis. From the ashes of its wartime destruction, Japan had become an economic powerhouse, a peaceful democratic nation with a strong global presence. His son, Emperor Akihito, assumed the throne at a time when Japan was looking to both honor its past and embrace a future defined by peace, prosperity, and diplomacy. Emperor Akihito's reign represented a marked departure from his father's earlier years. Unlike Hirohito, who'd presided over a country deeply embroiled in militarism and war, Akihito's era would be one of national reflection and reconciliation. His approach to the imperial role was rooted in empathy, humility, and a desire to heal the wounds of Japan's past. As the first emperor in modern history to express regret for Japan's wartime aggression, Akihito's reign was seen as a step toward more meaningful reconciliation, both domestically and with Japan's neighbors. Akihito's symbolic gestures toward peace and understanding were a key feature of his reign. From the beginning of his tenure, Akihito emphasized the importance of peace, particularly in the context of Japan's relations with its neighbors. His visits to countries that had suffered under Japan's wartime actions, including China and South Korea, were particularly significant. These visits, where Akihito expressed deep sorrow and regret for the suffering caused by Japan's imperialism, helped to soothe lingering tensions and foster a sense of reconciliation. By acknowledging the painful legacy of Japan's wartime aggression, Akihito demonstrated his commitment to a peaceful future and to the ideals of diplomacy. One of the most memorable moments of Akihito's early reign occurred in 1992, when he became the first emperor to visit China since Japan's defeat in World War II. The visit was historic in both its symbolism and its emotional resonance. In a speech during his trip, Akihito expressed his deep feelings of deep remorse and heartfelt apology for the suffering caused by Japan's wartime actions. This gesture of humility was not just about the emperor's personal apology. It was also a reflection of Japan's collective desire to move past the war and build a new relationship with its neighbors. The visit was an important step in Japan's efforts to mend its relationship with China, as well as with other countries that had been affected by Japan's imperialism. Akihito's reign also saw Japan grapple with shifting dynamics of international politics in the post-Cold War era. The end of the Cold War and the rise of new global challenges, including regional conflicts and economic shifts, presented Japan with new opportunities and responsibilities. Akihito's diplomatic engagements, combined with his symbolic leadership, helped Japan solidify its role as a responsible member of the international community. His commitment to peace, particularly through the support of global disarmament and humanitarian efforts, further cemented his position as an advocate for Japan's peaceful future. However, as Japan's economic power grew and its global influence expanded, the question of the imperial family's role continued to evolve. Akihito's reign was not without challenges, as the Japanese monarchy remained an institution steeped in tradition. The question of the emperor's role, both as a symbolic figurehead and as a potential source of national unity, remained an ongoing issue. In particular, the monarchy's role in a modern democratic society was a subject of debate. While many in Japan viewed the emperor as an important unifying force, others questioned the relevance of the monarchy in an increasingly globalized world. Despite these challenges, Akihito's leadership remained a steady presence during a time of rapid change. Japan's transition from a militaristic empire to a peaceful nation had been shaped by the emperor's symbolic role, but it was also grounded in the country's democratic values and the commitment to peace. The emperor was no longer the absolute ruler of the nation, but rather a symbol of Japan's historical continuity, cultural identity, and the values of peace and cooperation. Akihito's reign was defined by his ability to adapt to these changes, while maintaining the dignity and respect afforded to the imperial institution. One of the most significant developments in the latter part of Akihito's reign was his decision to step down from the throne. In 2016, Akihito made a rare public statement in which he expressed concerns about his ability to fulfill the duties of the emperor due to his advanced age and declining health. This marked the first time in over 2 centuries that a Japanese emperor had openly discussed the possibility of abdicating. Akihito's decision to abdicate was driven by a desire to ensure that the imperial family remained strong, and that the emperor's role would continue to be a meaningful and active one. In response to Akihito's request, the Japanese government passed a law in 2017 that allowed him to abdicate, setting the stage for a historic transition. Akihito formally stepped down on April 30, 2019, passing the throne to his son Naruhito. This marked the end of the Heisei era and the beginning of the Reiwa era. Akihito's abdication was a historic event, not only because of the rarity of such an occurrence, but also because it reflected the evolving role of the Japanese emperor in the modern world. The transition from Akihito to Naruhito represented a shift toward a new generation of leadership within the imperial family, one that would continue to balance the traditions of the past with the needs and aspirations of the present. For Akihito, his abdication symbolized the completion of his mission as emperor, to guide Japan through a period of peace, to reconcile with its neighbors, and to ensure that the imperial family remained an institution that served the people rather than ruling over them. His reign, which had seen Japan recover from the horrors of war and establish itself as a peaceful, prosperous nation, came to a close with a sense of fulfillment and continuity. Akihito's reign, though marked by challenges, was ultimately defined by his dedication to peace, humility, and the healing of Japan's wartime wounds. As Emperor Akihito began his reign in 1989, the legacy of his father Hirohito continued to shape both the imperial family and Japan itself. Hirohito's reign, which spanned from 1926 to 1989, left an indelible mark on Japan's history. From the heights of imperial power to the depths of defeat and recovery, Hirohito's leadership saw Japan through its most transformative and turbulent years. By the time he passed, Hirohito had become a figure of reconciliation and peace. But his legacy was complex and multifaceted, shaped by both his wartime role and his post-war efforts to guide Japan toward a peaceful future. Hirohito's legacy, particularly in the context of post-war Japan, is one that continues to be debated. His wartime actions, including his involvement in Japan's military expansion and his symbolic endorsement of the war effort, were never fully addressed in the years following Japan's surrender. While he never directly ordered military actions, his position as the emperor meant that his image was used by the military to justify Japan's aggression. This lingering association with Japan's wartime past created a complex legacy for Hirohito, one that was both revered and questioned by the Japanese people and the international community. In Japan, Hirohito's reign came to symbolize both the rise and fall of the nation. Under his leadership, Japan had gone from being a rising imperial power to a nation that was brought to its knees in the aftermath of World War II. Despite the destruction and devastation caused by the war, Hirohito's post-war role in Japan's recovery was central to the country's rehabilitation. His symbolic leadership provided a sense of continuity and unity as Japan transformed from a militaristic empire into a peaceful, democratic nation. One of Hirohito's most significant post-war decisions was his renunciation of divinity in 1946, following the new constitution's adoption. For centuries, Japanese emperors had been considered divine beings, direct descendants of the sun goddess Amaterasu in Shinto belief. Hirohito's renunciation of this divinity was a key moment in Japan's post-war transformation. It marked the shift from a monarch who had been seen as a living god to a constitutional monarch, serving as a symbolic figurehead for the nation. By making this symbolic gesture, Hirohito helped facilitate Japan's transition to a more modern and democratic society, where the emperor's power was relegated to ceremonial functions. In the decades following the war, Hirohito's role as emperor was largely ceremonial. His public appearances were carefully managed, and his speeches focused on themes of peace, progress, and reconciliation. His visits to countries that had suffered under Japan's wartime aggression, including China and South Korea, were particularly significant. During these visits, Hirohito expressed deep remorse for the suffering caused by Japan's imperialism and offered heartfelt apologies. These acts of reconciliation helped to heal some of the wounds left by Japan's wartime actions, although the scars of the war would never fully disappear. Hirohito's leadership was integral to Japan's recovery, but his legacy remains controversial, particularly in relation to the war. While many in Japan saw him as a symbol of national unity and resilience, others could not forget the atrocities committed during the war, including the Nanjing massacre, the treatment of prisoners of war, and the use of comfort women by the Japanese military. These war crimes, many of which have been acknowledged by the Japanese government, continue to cast a shadow over Hirohito's legacy. His failure to fully come to terms with Japan's wartime aggression and his reluctance to publicly apologize for the suffering caused by the war has been a point of contention for many, both within Japan and abroad. Despite these controversies, Hirohito's post-war reign was one of national healing and recovery. Under his leadership, Japan rebuilt itself into one of the world's leading economic powers, and the country became known for its technological innovation, industrial prowess, and commitment to peace. Hirohito's symbolic role as emperor helped to unite the Japanese people and provided a sense of continuity during a time of unprecedented change. He was a steady presence as Japan navigated its transformation from a war-ravaged nation to a modern, peaceful state. Hirohito's legacy was also shaped by his role in Japan's diplomacy. While he did not have direct involvement in foreign policy, his visits to other countries, particularly in the post-war years, helped to rebuild Japan's relationships with its neighbors. His visit to the United States in 1975 was a historic moment, as it marked the first time in Japan's history that an emperor had visited the US. The visit helped to strengthen the bond between the two nations, which had been tested during the war. Hirohito's diplomatic gestures were emblematic of Japan's desire to move beyond its wartime past and to establish itself as a peaceful and responsible member of the international community. The imperial family itself also played an important role in the evolution of Hirohito's legacy. After Hirohito's death in 1989, his son, Emperor Akihito, took the throne, bringing a new era of leadership to the Japanese imperial family. Akihito's reign would continue the themes of peace, humility, and reconciliation that his father had embraced in his later years. Akihito's approach to the imperial role, characterized by his engagement with the people and his personal commitment to peace, represented a departure from the more distant and symbolic role that his father had played during the war. Despite Akihito's new leadership, Hirohito's legacy remained influential in shaping the role of the emperor. While Akihito's reign would be defined by Japan's post-war recovery and its growing role in the global community, Hirohito's actions during the war and his post-war efforts to atone for Japan's past remained a key part of the emperor's legacy. Hirohito had been both a symbol of imperial glory and a figure who had presided over Japan's descent into war. His later years, marked by his role in Japan's recovery, helped to cement his place as a symbol of resilience and national unity. In the broader context of Japanese history, Hirohito's legacy is one of transition. From a divine monarch leading an empire engaged in aggressive warfare, to a symbol of peace and reconciliation in a nation determined to rebuild. His reign spanned the rise and fall of Japan's imperial ambitions, and his personal evolution from a figurehead of militarism to an advocate for peace was emblematic of Japan's own transformation in the 20th century. Hirohito's legacy, while complex and contentious, remains a vital part of Japan's modern identity, and his influence continues to be felt in the country's approach to peace, diplomacy, and the future of the imperial institution. In the decades following Emperor Hirohito's death in 1989, the Japanese imperial family, under the leadership of Emperor Akihito, continued to evolve in ways that reflected Japan's transition from a militaristic empire to a peaceful, democratic nation. The role of the emperor, once defined by imperial power and wartime symbolism, had undergone a fundamental transformation after World War II. The changes within the imperial family mirrored Japan's own shift toward modernity, peace, and international cooperation. The post-war imperial family became a symbol of national unity, but its influence on Japanese politics was vastly different from the days of Hirohito's reign. Under the new constitution, which was introduced in 1947, the emperor's role was strictly ceremonial, and political power had shifted entirely to Japan's elected officials. This meant that the emperor had no formal influence over the governance of the country, a stark contrast to the pre-war period when the emperor held significant authority over military and political decisions. Emperor Akihito's reign was defined by a deep commitment to this new, more humble role. He sought to make the imperial family more accessible to the Japanese people, distancing it from the traditional image of the emperor as a distant, almost divine figure. In this sense, Akihito's approach to the role of the emperor was deeply modern, reflecting the growing desire among the Japanese people for an imperial family that was connected to their everyday lives rather than one that was an isolated symbol of Japan's past. One of the key aspects of Akihito's reign was his genuine interest in engaging with the people of Japan. Unlike his father, who remained largely detached from the public, Akihito made a concerted effort to be involved in the lives of the citizens he symbolized. He and his wife, Empress Michiko, traveled extensively throughout Japan, visiting various regions and communities, particularly those affected by natural disasters or economic hardships. This active engagement allowed the imperial family to play a direct role in strengthening the bond between the monarchy and the Japanese people. A significant example of this was Akihito's personal involvement in disaster relief efforts. When natural disasters such as earthquakes and tsunamis struck Japan, the imperial family would often be seen visiting the affected areas, offering words of encouragement and solidarity. These visits were not just ceremonial. They were deeply personal acts that conveyed the emperor's genuine concern for the well-being of the Japanese people. Akihito's willingness to engage in such acts of compassion helped to humanize the imperial family, making it more relatable and approachable to the public. Another defining feature of Akihito's reign was his role in Japan's reconciliation with its neighbors. While Hirohito's reign had been marked by a reluctance to fully address Japan's wartime atrocities, Akihito took steps to acknowledge and atone for Japan's actions during the war. His visits to countries that had suffered under Japan's wartime aggression, such as China, South Korea, and the Philippines, were important gestures of remorse and reconciliation. Akihito's willingness to personally express regret for Japan's wartime actions was seen as a meaningful step in the healing process, helping to rebuild trust between Japan and its neighbors. Akihito's visits to China in particular were historic. In 1992, he became the first Japanese emperor to visit China since the war. During his visit, Akihito expressed deep feelings of deep remorse and heartfelt apology for the suffering caused by Japan's wartime actions. This public acknowledgement was seen as a significant gesture of goodwill, and it helped to improve Japan-China relations at a time when tensions over historical issues were still high. Akihito's approach to diplomacy, which emphasized humility and acknowledgement of past wrongs, contrasted sharply with the more distant symbolic approach taken by previous emperors. The role of the emperor also became increasingly intertwined with Japan's modern cultural identity. As Japan transitioned from a militaristic power to a peaceful nation, the imperial family was positioned as the embodiment of Japan's cultural continuity. Akihito, as the 125th emperor, was not only a symbol of Japan's history but also a living connection to its traditions. The emperor continued to perform traditional Shinto rituals and ceremonies, which were integral to Japan's cultural and spiritual identity. However, as Japan became more globally integrated and its culture modernized, the role of the emperor in promoting traditional values was balanced by his focus on internationalism, peace, and human rights. Akihito's reign also saw the imperial family become more engaged in global conversations about peace and disarmament. The emperor took part in various international forums, speaking out on issues such as nuclear disarmament and the promotion of human rights. His statements and actions emphasized Japan's commitment to global peace and security, aligning the imperial family with the country's post-war identity as a peaceful and cooperative global actor. One of the more recent and significant developments in the imperial family's modernization occurred in 2017, when Akihito publicly announced his desire to abdicate the throne. Due to his advanced age and declining health, Akihito expressed concerns about his ability to fulfill the duties of the emperor effectively. This announcement was groundbreaking, as it was the first time in modern history that an emperor had openly discussed the possibility of abdication. Akihito's decision to step down was met with both respect and sadness by the Japanese people, who had come to see him as a symbol of the country's post-war recovery and progress. In 2019, Akihito formally abdicated, passing the throne to his son Naruhito. This marked the end of the Heisei era, which had spanned from 1989 to 2019, and the beginning of the Reiwa era. Akihito's abdication was a symbolic moment in Japan's modern history, as it reflected not only the changes within the imperial family, but also Japan's continued evolution as a modern democratic nation. Naruhito's ascension to the throne represented a new chapter for the imperial family, one that would continue to balance tradition with the realities of a rapidly changing world. As Emperor Akihito ascended the throne in 1989, Japan entered a new era, one that was marked by both continuity and transformation. The transition from Hirohito to Akihito was not just a change in leadership. It was a reflection of the broader changes within Japan itself. The post-war generation had come to terms with the consequences of Japan's wartime aggression, and the imperial family, once a symbol of militarism and conquest, had evolved into a figurehead for peace and reconciliation. Akihito's reign marked the beginning of a new chapter for both the monarchy and Japan, a chapter defined by the values of humility, diplomacy, and human connection. Akihito's ascension was not only symbolic, but also practical. It represented the continuation of Japan's monarchy, an institution that had endured for over a millennium, yet had been profoundly reshaped by the events of the 20th century. Hirohito's reign had witnessed the rise and fall of the Japanese Empire, and his eventual transition to a more ceremonial role in post-war Japan laid the groundwork for the future of the imperial family. Akihito's reign, however, would be shaped by a country that was no longer a militaristic power, but a peaceful, democratic society, focused on rebuilding its identity both at home and abroad. The transition also highlighted the evolving role of the emperor in a modern democratic Japan. Under the post-war constitution, the emperor was no longer a divine figure or a ruler with political power. Instead, the emperor's role was purely symbolic. This shift was a critical component of Japan's post-war reconstruction, as it allowed the nation to distance itself from its militaristic past, while still preserving the cultural and historical significance of the imperial family. Hirohito's decision to renounce his divinity after the war was a symbolic gesture that reflected Japan's commitment to peace, and Akihito's reign further solidified that commitment. Akihito's approach to his role was different from that of his father, Hirohito. While Hirohito had been more reserved and often distanced from the public, Akihito was more engaged with the Japanese people. His reign was characterized by a more humanistic approach to the imperial role, with Akihito often seen interacting directly with citizens, especially during times of national distress. Akihito's visits to areas devastated by natural disasters, such as the 2011 earthquake and tsunami, demonstrated his personal commitment to the well-being of his people. His presence at these events was not merely ceremonial but deeply empathetic, offering the Japanese people a sense of connection to their emperor during times of hardship. One of Akihito's most significant contributions was his role in Japan's relationship with its neighbors. His diplomacy, particularly with China and South Korea, helped ease tensions that had lingered since the end of the war. Akihito's expressions of remorse for Japan's wartime actions, particularly during his visits to countries affected by Japanese aggression, were seen as a sincere attempt to heal the wounds of the past. These gestures of reconciliation were not just symbolic. They played a crucial role in rebuilding trust between Japan and its neighbors, fostering an atmosphere of cooperation and understanding in East Asia. Akihito's reign was also marked by Japan's continuing economic success. The 1980s and 1990s saw Japan solidify its position as one of the world's largest economies, and the imperial family, under Akihito's leadership, was an important part of Japan's cultural identity. The emperor's role as a symbol of unity and continuity helped Japan navigate its role as a global economic power while maintaining its commitment to peace. In this period, the imperial family also embraced a more modern and approachable image, making it more relatable to younger generations of Japanese citizens. However, as the years went by, Akihito's reign also faced challenges. Japan's demographic shift, with an aging population and a declining birth rate, raised questions about the future of the imperial family. The issue of succession became more pressing as Akihito's health began to decline in the 2000s. Under the current Japanese imperial law, only male heirs can ascend the throne, and with fewer male heirs in the imperial family, the future of the monarchy was uncertain. This led to debates about whether Japan should amend its laws to allow for female succession, a question that remains unresolved. Akihito's abdication in 2019 further emphasized the evolving nature of the imperial family. His decision to step down due to his advanced age and health concerns was a historic moment, as it was the first time in over 2 centuries that an emperor had abdicated. Akihito's abdication marked the end of the Heisei era and the beginning of the Reiwa era under his son, Emperor Naruhito. Naruhito's ascension represented a new generation for the imperial family, one that would continue the work of peace and diplomacy established by his father while facing the new challenges of a rapidly changing world. The abdication also underscored the increasing importance of modernizing the imperial family's role to ensure its relevance in a democratic society. The emperor's status as a symbolic figure is now more important than ever, as Japan navigates its place in the 21st century. The Japanese monarchy, though stripped of its political power, remains a key element of Japan's identity and culture. It serves as a reminder of the country's long history, its recovery from the war, and its commitment to peace. Emperor Naruhito's reign, like that of his father, will be marked by Japan's continuing engagement with the world and its focus on maintaining peace and harmony. As Japan enters the Reiwa era, the imperial family remains a crucial symbol of the country's identity, bridging its past with its present and future. The role of the emperor may have changed over the years, but its significance as a symbol of unity and national pride remains intact. The imperial family continues to serve as a link between Japan's ancient traditions and its modern, peaceful society. As Emperor Akihito ascended the throne in 1989, the symbolic and ceremonial role of the emperor continued to evolve in response to the changing dynamics of Japan's political, economic and social landscape. Akihito's reign, which spanned from 1989 to 2019, would be defined by efforts to modernize the imperial family while adhering to Japan's traditional values. While the emperor's role under the post-war constitution had been reduced to one of symbolic importance, Akihito's approach to his duties marked a departure from the more distant and formal approach taken by his father, Hirohito. Akihito sought to humanize the imperial family and ensure its relevance in a rapidly changing society. One of the key elements of Akihito's reign was his focus on accessibility and empathy. Whereas Hirohito had remained somewhat detached from the public, Akihito made efforts to engage with the Japanese people on a deeper level. He and his wife, Empress Michiko, were seen as more approachable and relatable to ordinary citizens. Their presence in public events, their personal involvement in charitable work, and their visits to areas affected by natural disasters helped to establish the emperor and empress as figures of compassion and connection rather than aloof symbols of power. This humanizing approach was especially evident in Akihito's personal engagements. Akihito was known for his quiet, reflective nature and his genuine interest in understanding the lives of the Japanese people. He and Empress Michiko made numerous visits to disaster-stricken areas, comforting survivors and offering support. After the devastating earthquake and tsunami in 2011, the imperial couple visited the affected regions, offering solace to those who had lost their homes and loved ones. This was not a mere ceremonial gesture. It was an expression of personal concern and a deep commitment to the welfare of the people. Akihito's empathy and direct involvement in the efforts helped redefine the role of the emperor as one rooted in emotional connection and public service. His presence during times of national grief, such as following natural disasters, humanized the imperial family and made it more relatable to the people. The Japanese monarchy, once associated with imperial conquests and military glory, was now seen as a force for compassion and national healing. Akihito's ability to serve as a calming presence during times of crisis solidified the monarchy's symbolic role as a unifier for the nation. Beyond his personal efforts to engage with the public, Akihito also sought to modernize the institution of the imperial family in ways that aligned with Japan's evolving society. As Japan moved into the 21st century, the question of the imperial family's role in a democratic society remained at the forefront of national discussion. The emperor was now, constitutionally, a mere figurehead with no political power, but the continued prominence of the imperial family raised questions about its relevance in a modern secular society. Akihito, who'd been deeply influenced by his own experiences as the son of Hirohito, understood the need to balance tradition with modernity. A central issue that arose during Akihito's reign was the question of succession. Under Japan's current imperial law, only male heirs can inherit the throne, which posed a challenge given the decreasing number of male members in the imperial family. Akihito's son, Naruhito, succeeded him as emperor, but with the absence of a direct male heir, the question of whether Japan should amend its succession laws to allow female emperors became a topic of ongoing debate. While Akihito refrained from taking a direct stance on the issue, his reign coincided with an increasing movement for gender equality within Japan. The question of female succession remains unresolved, but Akihito's own approach to the monarchy, one characterized by humility, accessibility, and engagement with the people, has helped foster a more progressive image of the imperial family. Another area where Akihito's modernization efforts were felt was in Japan's foreign diplomacy. While the emperor had long been a symbol of Japan's cultural and spiritual identity, his role in diplomatic relations became more prominent under Akihito's leadership. The emperor's visits to other countries, particularly to those affected by Japan's wartime aggression, were seen as important steps in fostering reconciliation and building bridges between Japan and its neighbors. Akihito's 1992 visit to China, for example, was a historic moment in Japan-China relations. During this visit, Akihito expressed deep regret for Japan's wartime actions, and his words were seen as a sincere attempt to heal the wounds of the past. Akihito's approach to diplomacy was one of humility and reconciliation, a stark contrast to the militaristic imperialism associated with Japan's pre-war leadership. His diplomatic efforts helped reshape Japan's image in the world, presenting the emperor as a figure committed to peace, understanding, and international cooperation. By personally expressing remorse and offering apologies for Japan's wartime actions, Akihito contributed to the ongoing process of healing and reconciliation with Japan's neighbors. His reign, defined by a commitment to peace and human connection, helped redefine the legacy of the emperor in the modern era. In addition to his diplomatic efforts, Akihito's reign also saw the imperial family become more involved in Japan's cultural and scientific endeavors. Akihito, a trained historian and an accomplished scholar, had a deep interest in the arts and sciences. His involvement in cultural preservation and his promotion of Japan's rich cultural heritage further solidified his image as an emperor who valued Japan's traditions while embracing the modern world. Akihito's dedication to cultural preservation was not only an expression of his personal interests, but also an acknowledgement of the important role that Japan's cultural heritage plays in shaping the nation's identity in the contemporary era. As Akihito's reign progressed, his role as emperor continued to evolve. He had become a respected figure not just within Japan but also on the global stage. His legacy, characterized by his efforts to humanize the imperial family, foster international reconciliation, and engage with Japan's cultural heritage, cemented his place as one of the most beloved emperors in modern Japanese history. On April 30th, 2019, Japan experienced a historic event with the abdication of Emperor Akihito, marking the end of the Heisei era, which had begun in 1989. Akihito's decision to step down from the throne was the first abdication in over 2 centuries, a reflection of the changing dynamics of the imperial family and Japan's evolving political landscape. For the Japanese people, Akihito's abdication marked the end of an era of peace, recovery, and diplomacy, where the emperor had served as a symbol of national unity, resilience, and reconciliation. Akihito's decision to abdicate was driven by his advancing age and deteriorating health. In a rare and deeply personal address to the nation in 2016, Akihito expressed concerns about his ability to continue fulfilling his duties as emperor. He spoke of the burden of his responsibilities, which had grown increasingly difficult due to his age and health problems. Akihito's words resonated deeply with the Japanese public, as they reflected his humility and the personal nature of his role as emperor. The emperor, though no longer a political figure, had always been regarded with immense reverence, and his ability to speak candidly about his concerns showed the deep emotional connection he had with his people. Japan's constitution, which had been enacted in 1947, did not allow for abdication, so Akihito's decision required a change in the law. The Japanese government, after extensive deliberations, passed a special law in 2017 that allowed Akihito to step down, making him the first emperor in modern history to voluntarily abdicate. This law, which was passed with the understanding that it would apply only to Akihito, set the stage for a peaceful transition of power. It was a significant moment in Japan's history, signaling the continuity of the imperial family while addressing the changing needs of modern society. The abdication ceremony itself was a deeply symbolic event, as it was a reflection of Japan's transition into the Reiwa era, under the leadership of Emperor Naruhito, Akihito's son. The formal abdication took place on April 30th, 2019, in a series of ceremonies that included a private farewell and the passing of the imperial regalia from Akihito to Naruhito. The regalia, which consist of the sword, the mirror, and the jewel, are traditional symbols of the emperor's power and authority. The passing of the regalia marked the formal end of Akihito's reign and the beginning of his son's, though the symbolic nature of the monarchy had long since reduced the emperor's direct involvement in political governance. For Akihito, the act of abdicating was not just a political transition, it was also a personal and emotional one. Having served as emperor for over 3 decades, Akihito had become a deeply respected figure, not only in Japan but also abroad. His reign was defined by efforts to promote peace, foster international reconciliation, and humanize the imperial family. Throughout his time as emperor, Akihito had consistently placed a focus on healing the wounds of Japan's wartime past, expressing deep regret for the suffering caused by Japan's military actions during World War II. His visits to countries affected by Japan's aggression, such as China, South Korea, and the Philippines, were seen as acts of genuine remorse and a desire to foster peace in the region. Akihito's reign was also marked by Japan's continuing economic and cultural success. Under his leadership, Japan became one of the world's leading economies, and the imperial family adapted to a modern world in which Japan's identity as a peaceful, democratic nation was central. Akihito's personal humility and deep empathy for his people were integral to his approach as emperor. His efforts to engage with the public, particularly in times of national crisis or disaster, endeared him to the people. His reign had seen Japan recover from the scars of war and transform into a prosperous, peaceful nation. As Akihito prepared to abdicate, he expressed his hopes for the future of the imperial family in Japan. In his final remarks as emperor, Akihito emphasized the importance of peace, unity, and respect for others. He spoke of the lessons he had learned during his time as emperor, particularly the value of empathy and understanding. Akihito's reign had been defined by his efforts to bridge the gap between Japan's wartime past and its peaceful present, and he hoped that the imperial family would continue to be a source of unity and inspiration for the Japanese people. The transition from Akihito to Naruhito was both symbolic and practical. Emperor Naruhito's ascension to the throne marked a new chapter for the imperial family, and his approach to the monarchy would build upon the foundation laid by his father. Naruhito had long been involved in public duties and diplomatic efforts, and his reign promised to continue the themes of peace, diplomacy, and humanitarian work that had defined his father's time on the throne. While the emperor's role remained symbolic, Naruhito was well prepared to lead the imperial family through the challenges of the modern world. Akihito's abdication and the subsequent transition to Naruhito's reign marked the end of the Heisei era, a period of peace and prosperity for Japan. The Heisei era was one in which the emperor's role was increasingly defined by his symbolic presence, rather than by any direct political influence. Under Akihito's leadership, the imperial family became more connected to the people, and Japan's post-war identity was shaped by efforts to atone for the past and build a peaceful, democratic future. While the abdication marked the end of Akihito's era, his legacy would continue to influence Japan for years to come. His reign had seen Japan evolve from a nation recovering from the devastation of war into a respected global power. Akihito's commitment to peace, diplomacy, and empathy helped to define his legacy as a leader who transcended the traditional role of the emperor, embracing a more human-centered approach to his duties. As Naruhito assumed the throne, Japan looked forward to a new chapter, but Akihito's legacy of peace, compassion, and reconciliation would remain a guiding force for the imperial family and the nation. As Emperor Akihito's reign came to a close in 2019, Japan was in a period of transition, not only in terms of its leadership, but also its identity. The Reiwa era began with Emperor Naruhito's ascension to the throne, but the legacy of the imperial family, shaped over centuries and notably through the challenges of the 20th century, remained a powerful force in Japan's national identity. The imperial family, particularly under Akihito's reign, had evolved from a symbol of militaristic power to one of peace, reconciliation, and diplomacy. The family's transformation mirrored Japan's broader societal and political changes as it emerged from the ashes of war and found its place in the modern world. In the 21st century, Japan's imperial family remains a unique institution. While the role of the emperor is largely symbolic, it continues to serve as a symbol of continuity, tradition, and unity for the Japanese people. The Japanese monarchy is one of the oldest in the world, and the emperor represents the cultural and historical ties that bind the nation together. Despite the limitations placed on the imperial family by the post-war constitution, the institution remains integral to the fabric of Japanese life, embodying the nation's values and ideals, especially those of peace, humility, and respect for tradition. Under Emperor Naruhito, the imperial family's role has continued to evolve in line with Japan's changing needs. Naruhito, much like his father Akihito, understands the importance of the imperial family in fostering national unity and connecting with the Japanese people. His public appearances, though ceremonial, continue to emphasize themes of peace and the importance of the emperor's role in promoting understanding both within Japan and with the international community. Akihito's legacy of empathy and compassion for the Japanese people is one that Naruhito has vowed to carry forward, ensuring that the imperial family remains a symbol of resilience and unity in an ever-changing world. One of the challenges facing the modern Japanese imperial family is the issue of succession. The current Japanese imperial law, which prohibits female succession, has raised questions about the future of the monarchy, particularly given the shrinking number of male heirs in the family. With Emperor Naruhito's only child, Princess Aiko, being a girl, Japan's succession laws have become a topic of national debate. Many in Japan, particularly among younger generations, have argued for gender equality in the monarchy, believing that women should have the same right to inherit the throne as men. This issue has sparked discussions about the future of the imperial family and the potential need for constitutional reform. The modernization of the imperial family has also been reflected in its engagement with contemporary social issues. Akihito, and later Naruhito, sought to make the imperial family more connected to the people. not only in ceremonial duties but also in the realm of charity and public service. The Emperor and Empress have continued to advocate for causes such as environmental preservation, disaster relief, and mental health awareness, positioning the imperial family as a force for positive change in Japan's social landscape. In these areas, the Emperor has become a figurehead for modern Japan's values, helping to shape a narrative of compassion, responsibility, and awareness that resonates with the population. The relationship between the imperial family and Japan's neighbors has also been central to its modern identity. The imperial family, particularly Akihito, played a significant role in healing historical wounds between Japan and other Asian nations. Through his visits to China, South Korea, and other countries, Akihito was able to demonstrate Japan's commitment to reconciliation and peace. His statements of regret for the suffering caused by Japan's wartime actions helped to smooth relations with these nations, and his efforts to promote understanding were seen as a critical step in Japan's ongoing effort to atone for its past. In recent years, the Japanese imperial family has also embraced new forms of communication, adapting to the digital age. The younger members of the imperial family, including Naruhito's daughter, Princess Aiko, and his brother, Crown Prince Fumihito, are more engaged with social media and the public, giving a modern touch to the traditional institution. While the Emperor's personal use of digital platforms is limited, members of the imperial family have increasingly made use of modern tools to share their activities, causes, and initiatives. This use of technology reflects Japan's broader adaptation to the modern world, with the imperial family serving as both a historical institution and a forward-thinking symbol of national pride. The imperial family's role as a symbol of Japan's cultural identity continues to be vital, but it faces challenges as Japan grapples with contemporary issues such as gender equality, modernization, and its position in an increasingly interconnected world. The debate surrounding succession is one of the most pressing issues facing the imperial family, but it's also an opportunity for Japan to reassess its traditions and values. The possibility of reforming the imperial succession laws to allow for female emperors is part of a larger conversation about Japan's future, one that acknowledges the nation's rich cultural heritage while embracing the ideals of equality and progress. The imperial family, under the leadership of Emperor Naruhito, will continue to play a central role in shaping Japan's future. The monarchy will remain a powerful symbol of national unity, embodying both Japan's long history and its commitment to peace, compassion, and social responsibility. The emperor's symbolic role may have changed from the days of Hirohito's reign, but the institution remains a fundamental part of Japanese society. As Japan faces the challenges of the 21st century, the imperial family will continue to represent the nation's resilience, its respect for tradition, and its pursuit of a peaceful, prosperous future. As the Japanese imperial family entered the 21st century, its role as a symbol of national identity continued to evolve in response to both internal and external changes. Japan's post-war transformation from a militaristic empire to a peaceful democratic nation had reshaped the monarchy's place in society. But as Japan became a global economic power and navigated the complexities of the modern world, the perception of the imperial family remained deeply intertwined with the country's evolving identity. The imperial family had undergone profound changes since the end of World War II, when the emperor's divine status was renounced and the family was relegated to a ceremonial symbolic role. The monarchy, once the center of Japan's political and military power, was now a figurehead of unity and continuity, representing the resilience of the Japanese people after the war. Emperor Hirohito had played a significant role in this transformation, shifting from a leader associated with Japan's imperial past to a symbol of peace and recovery. This legacy, however, had been complicated by the imperial family's ties to Japan's wartime actions, which had left deep scars in the collective memory of both the Japanese people and Japan's neighbors. Emperor Akihito, who ascended the throne in 1989, sought to build on his father's legacy by engaging with the Japanese people on a more personal level, emphasizing empathy and humility over the aloofness traditionally associated with the imperial family. Akihito's public engagements, especially during times of national disaster or distress, further humanized the monarchy, making the imperial family more relatable to the public. His efforts to promote reconciliation with Japan's neighbors, particularly through visits to China and South Korea, helped to repair some of the damage caused by Japan's wartime aggression. In the years following Akihito's abdication in 2019, the imperial family continued to hold an important place in Japanese society, but its influence was increasingly symbolic rather than political. The imperial family, in its modern form, represented Japan's commitment to peace, diplomacy, and the preservation of traditional values. Emperor Naruhito, who succeeded Akihito, continued his father's focus on empathy, public service, and international cooperation, working to ensure that the imperial family remained relevant in a rapidly changing world. However, the imperial family's role as a symbol of continuity and national identity has not been without challenges. Japan's rapid modernization and the increasing influence of global cultural and political forces have prompted some to question the relevance of the monarchy in the 21st century. In a society that increasingly values democratic principles and individual rights, the continued existence of a hereditary monarchy has been a subject of debate. While many Japanese continue to revere the imperial family as a unifying symbol, others see it as an outdated institution that does not reflect the country's contemporary values. The issue of gender equality within the imperial family has also become a point of contention. Under Japan's current imperial law, which was established in the early 20th century, only male heirs are allowed to inherit the throne. This has led to concerns about the future of the monarchy, especially given the shrinking number of male heirs in the imperial family. With the birth of Emperor Naruhito's daughter, Princess Aiko, the question of female succession became more pressing. Calls for reform of the imperial succession laws have grown louder, with some advocating for the inclusion of women in the line of succession. However, traditionalists in Japan continue to oppose such changes, arguing that the monarchy's continuity must be preserved in its current form. In addition to the issue of succession, the imperial family's involvement in modern political life remains a delicate subject. Although the emperor and other members of the imperial family have no political power, their actions and statements are still closely scrutinized, especially in the context of Japan's complex international relations. The emperor's role as a symbol of national unity and a representative of Japan's cultural identity has meant that the imperial family is often expected to take on roles that extend beyond mere ceremonial duties. For example, the emperor and empress often serve as representatives of Japan on the international stage, promoting cultural exchange and goodwill between Japan and other nations. The modern challenges facing the imperial family are not unique to Japan. Monarchies around the world, from Europe to the Middle East, have had to adapt to changing political, social, and cultural environments. As Japan continues to navigate the complexities of its post-war identity, the imperial family's role will undoubtedly continue to evolve. However, it seems likely that the imperial family will remain an important symbol of Japan's cultural and historical continuity, even as its political influence continues to diminish. One of the key factors in the imperial family's continued relevance is its ability to adapt to the changing needs of Japanese society. In the past, the emperor was seen as a figure of divine authority and political power, but in the modern era, the monarchy's primary role is to provide a sense of national unity and continuity. The emperor's personal qualities, his empathy, humility, and commitment to public service, are increasingly seen as the defining characteristics of the monarchy. While the emperor no longer wields political power, his presence provides a stabilizing influence in times of crisis and a reminder of Japan's cultural heritage. In recent years, the imperial family's relationship with the Japanese public has become more complex. On the one hand, the emperor and his family are seen as national symbols, representing the unity and resilience of the Japanese people. On the other hand, there are growing calls for reform, particularly in relation to the issue of succession and gender equality. The future of the imperial family will depend on how it continues to evolve in response to these changing dynamics, balancing tradition with the needs of modern society. As Japan looks to the future, the imperial family will remain a central part of the country's identity. Whether through ceremonial duties, public service, or diplomacy, the imperial family will continue to serve as a symbol of Japan's commitment to peace, stability, and cultural preservation. However, the monarchy's role in the political and social life of Japan will undoubtedly continue to shift, reflecting the changing values of the nation and the world. As Japan enters the Reiwa era under Emperor Naruhito, the role of the imperial family remains a subject of ongoing reflection and discussion. With the abdication of Emperor Akihito in 2019, Japan entered a new chapter, marked by change and continuity. While the imperial family's role is primarily symbolic in the modern world, the deep cultural and historical connections the Japanese people have with the monarchy ensure that the family continues to serve as a cornerstone of Japan's identity. The challenges faced by the imperial family in the 21st century are reflective of broader social, political, and cultural changes in Japan. Japan is a society that is increasingly globalized and technologically advanced, and the imperial family, like many traditional institutions, must navigate the complexities of modern life while maintaining respect for centuries-old traditions. The monarchy remains an institution deeply embedded in Japan's history, but the question of its relevance in a rapidly evolving society remains a topic of ongoing debate. One of the most pressing issues facing the imperial family is the question of succession. Under current Japanese law, only male descendants can inherit the throne, and with a shrinking number of male heirs, the issue has become one of the most important discussions in Japanese politics. Emperor Naruhito has one daughter, Princess Aiko, but under the current succession laws she cannot inherit the throne. The question of female succession is a complex and contentious issue, as it challenges both traditional practices and the evolving values of gender equality in modern Japan. In recent years, there have been growing calls for reform of Japan's imperial succession laws to allow for female emperors. Supporters argue that allowing women to inherit the throne would help ensure the continuity of the imperial family, given the declining number of male heirs. However, opposition to female succession remains strong, particularly among conservative factions who believe that changing the law would undermine the traditional structure of the monarchy. The debate surrounding female succession highlights the tension between tradition and modernity, and it remains one of the central issues facing the imperial family as Japan moves forward into the 21st century. The imperial family's role also continues to be defined by its symbolic importance in Japanese society. The emperor, while no longer holding political power, represents the unity and continuity of the Japanese people. His presence at national events, ceremonies, and diplomatic engagements serves as a reminder of Japan's cultural heritage and its commitment to peace. In a society where many institutions are rapidly evolving, the imperial family remains a symbol of stability and tradition. In addition to their symbolic role, the members of the imperial family continue to serve as representatives of Japan on the international stage. Emperor Naruhito and Empress Masako have already undertaken several diplomatic trips, continuing the tradition of their predecessors in fostering good relations with other nations. Their participation in international forums, their engagements with foreign leaders, and their work in promoting cultural exchange and humanitarian causes all reinforce the monarchy's role as a peaceful and unifying force in the world. Japan's global image as a peaceful, democratic nation is in part shaped by the imperial family's diplomatic efforts and commitment to reconciliation. Despite the challenges the imperial family faces in terms of succession and its evolving role, the institution remains highly respected by the Japanese public. The monarchy is viewed as a symbol of Japan's cultural identity, and the imperial family's efforts to modernize and engage with the people have strengthened the bond between the monarchy and the nation. Emperor Naruhito, much like his father, has sought to make the imperial family more accessible and relevant to the Japanese people. His personal background, having spent time abroad and being well versed in international affairs, positions him as a modern monarch capable of leading the imperial family through the challenges of the 21st century. The modern era has also seen the imperial family embrace new forms of communication. As Japan's digital landscape evolves, the imperial family has adapted by engaging with the public through media and social media platforms. While the emperor's personal use of social media is limited, the imperial family's outreach through official channels has increased, allowing the public to stay connected with the family's activities. This shift reflects Japan's broader embrace of technology and globalization, as the imperial family navigates its place in a world where traditional forms of communication are increasingly supplemented by digital platforms. One of the most significant aspects of the imperial family's continued relevance is its ability to represent Japan's enduring values of peace, humility, and cultural pride. While the emperor's role is largely symbolic, his influence as a unifying figure cannot be understated. In times of crisis, such as after natural disasters, the emperor's presence serves as a comforting reminder of the resilience of the Japanese people. In times of celebration, his role as a cultural figurehead reinforces the nation's sense of identity and shared history. As Japan continues to face challenges such as an aging population, economic pressures, and shifting international dynamics, the imperial family's role in fostering national unity will remain important. The monarchy, although symbolic in nature, continues to serve as a stabilizing force in a rapidly changing world. The emperor, through his personal example of compassion, diplomacy, and service, embodies Japan's commitment to peace, cooperation, and cultural preservation. Looking to the future, the imperial family's role will likely continue to evolve in response to Japan's changing needs. As Japan faces new social, economic, and geopolitical challenges, the monarchy will remain a symbol of continuity and national pride, serving as a bridge between Japan's past and its future. The question of succession, the ongoing debate about gender equality, and the role of the imperial family in global diplomacy will continue to shape the monarchy's future. However, one thing remains certain. The Japanese imperial family, under the leadership of Emperor Naruhito and future generations, will continue to play an important role in Japan's modern identity and its place in the world. As we reach the final chapter of this documentary on Emperor Hirohito and his legacy, we reflect on the profound transformation Japan underwent throughout his reign, as well as the enduring significance of the imperial family in shaping Japan's modern identity. The transition from Hirohito to Akihito, and subsequently to Naruhito, has not only marked a change in leadership but also a continued evolution of the monarchy itself. From an emperor presiding over imperial ambitions and the devastation of war to one who symbolizes national unity, peace, and reconciliation, the monarchy's role has adapted in response to Japan's changing values, its recovery from war, and its emergence as a global leader. The imperial family's journey through the 20th and 21st centuries is a unique testament to the resilience of Japan's cultural identity. From the early years of Hirohito's reign, where Japan was a rising power with militaristic aspirations, to the quiet humility of Akihito's reign, where the emperor became a symbol of healing, the monarchy's narrative is inextricably linked to the nation's rise from the ashes of defeat to the prosperity and peace that define modern Japan. The imperial family has been more than a figurehead. Its symbolic importance has played an instrumental role in rebuilding Japan's sense of national pride and identity in the post-war era. Hirohito's leadership during Japan's war years remains one of the most debated and controversial aspects of his reign. While he was not directly responsible for the decisions that led to Japan's aggression, his role as emperor and the legitimacy his figurehead status provided to Japan's military actions cannot be overlooked. However, as Japan transitioned to a peaceful nation, Hirohito's legacy began to shift as he moved from the symbol of military might to one of peaceful unity. His renunciation of divinity in the post-war years signified a major shift in both the emperor's role and Japan's cultural identity. The monarchy's involvement in state matters would never return to the same level of authority, but Hirohito's role as a symbol of continuity helped guide Japan through its painful recovery. Akihito's reign, however, is often viewed as the turning point in the imperial family's modern image. As emperor, Akihito was dedicated to healing the wounds of the past, making repeated efforts to express remorse for Japan's wartime actions and promoting peace in both words and actions. His personal approach to the throne, one marked by humility, empathy, and public engagement, earned him the admiration of the Japanese people. His public visits to disaster-stricken areas and efforts to personally connect with citizens endeared him to the nation, reinforcing the symbolic role of the emperor as not only a figure of authority, but also one of compassion. Akihito's approach represented a modernization of the imperial role, transforming the emperor into a more human and relatable symbol of Japan's resilience and dedication to peace. In 2019, with Akihito's abdication, Japan entered a new era with the ascension of Emperor Naruhito. This transition, while symbolically significant, was also a reflection of Japan's ongoing adaptation to the modern world. The monarchy, once at the center of political and military power, was now firmly relegated to a symbolic, ceremonial role. Naruhito, who has long been involved in public duties and diplomatic efforts, entered the throne as a modern monarch, well aware of the challenges that lay ahead for the imperial family. The abdication of Akihito and the ascension of Naruhito also raised questions about the future of the imperial family, particularly in regard to the issue of succession. With no male heirs beyond Naruhito, the question of how Japan will address the issue of female succession has gained prominence. The debate over whether women should be allowed to inherit the throne is one of the key issues facing the monarchy in the 21st century, highlighting the tension between tradition and the push for gender equality. The continued survival of the monarchy will depend on how Japan navigates these challenges and whether it can adapt its traditions to meet the needs of contemporary society. Despite these challenges, the monarchy continues to play a central role in Japan's national identity. The emperor, as the symbol of the state, continues to be a source of unity for the Japanese people, particularly during times of national crisis or celebration. While the emperor no longer has the political power he once held, his symbolic importance is undiminished. Whether through ceremonial duties, diplomatic relations, or engagement with the people, the emperor remains a figure of continuity, a living embodiment of Japan's history, culture, and values. Looking ahead, the imperial family's role will likely continue to evolve, but its symbolic significance will remain intact. The monarchy, as an institution, represents Japan's connection to its past, its commitment to peace and reconciliation, and its dedication to building a better future. Emperor Naruhito's reign, while facing the challenges of modernization and societal change, will continue to build on the legacy of peace, humility, and diplomacy established by his father, Akihito, and his grandfather, Hirohito. The imperial family will remain a cornerstone of Japan's identity, a symbol of national pride, unity, and the enduring strength of the Japanese people. In conclusion, the history of Japan's imperial family is one of transformation, resilience, and adaptation. From the era of imperial conquest to the modern age of peace and diplomacy, the monarchy has served as a symbol of continuity and national pride, weathering the storms of war, defeat, and recovery. The abdications, transitions, and changing roles of the emperors reflect the evolving nature of Japan itself, an evolving nation that has learned from its past and seeks to build a future defined by peace, unity, and respect for tradition. The legacy of Hirohito, Akihito, and Naruhito is not just one of the imperial family but of the nation that they represent, a nation that has endured through centuries of change and remains resolutely committed to the ideals of peace, compassion, and harmony. As we close this journey through the history of the Japanese imperial family, we are reminded of the profound transformation that has taken place within both the monarchy and Japan itself. From the tumultuous years of Hirohito's reign, which saw Japan emerge as a military power, to the post-war era of recovery and reconciliation under Akihito, the imperial family has been an enduring symbol of Japan's resilience and commitment to peace. Hirohito's reign, despite its controversies, marked a period of monumental change. From the horrors of war to the devastation of defeat, Hirohito navigated a path that ultimately led Japan to embrace a future defined by peace and democracy. His eventual renunciation of divinity was a pivotal moment in Japan's transition from an imperial power to a peaceful, constitutional monarchy. As emperor, Hirohito was a symbol of continuity, but his post-war years also underscored Japan's commitment to healing the wounds of the past and rebuilding a society centered on peace. Akihito's reign, which followed Hirohito's abdication in 1989, further redefined the role of the emperor. Akihito sought to engage more personally with the Japanese people, embracing his role as a compassionate leader, especially during times of crisis. His efforts to promote peace, both domestically and internationally, helped to heal some of the scars left by Japan's wartime aggression. His apologies for Japan's actions during World War II, combined with his active diplomacy, became a testament to the emperor's role in fostering reconciliation and goodwill. As Emperor Naruhito takes the throne, Japan enters a new era, but the legacy of the imperial family remains steadfast. While the monarchy's role has evolved from one of absolute power to a symbolic figurehead, its significance in Japan's national identity is undiminished. The imperial family continues to be a symbol of continuity, stability, and cultural pride. Even in a modern world where political power has shifted to elected officials, the emperor's role as a symbol of the state remains vital to the unity of the Japanese people. Looking to the future, Japan faces new challenges, but the imperial family remains a central part of the nation's identity. Whether in the continuing debate about gender equality and the succession laws, or the evolving role of the monarchy in a democratic society, the imperial family's legacy will continue to be defined by its ability to adapt while maintaining the traditions that have defined it for over a millennium. In the end, the legacy of Hirohito, Akihito, and Naruhito will always be one of transformation, resilience, and the enduring strength of a nation that has learned from its past, sought redemption, and worked tirelessly to build a peaceful and prosperous future. The imperial family, symbolizing Japan's historical continuity, continues to serve as a reminder of the country's journey from war to peace, from division to unity, and from the past to the present. As we reflect on the remarkable history of Japan's imperial family, we are reminded that their journey is not just a story of monarchy, but of a nation's evolution, a testament to the power of reconciliation, compassion, and the enduring pursuit of peace.